He sat at the same table every Thursday night for 3 years, ordered the most expensive meal on the menu, then sent it back untouched. No one at Callaway's finest restaurant ever questioned Nathan Callaway. Not when he was worth $4.2 billion, not when he wore his grief like armor and his silence like a weapon. But tonight, a tired waitress with flowers still on her sleeve and rent 3 weeks overdue walked up to his table and said the 7 words that would crack everything open. "Sir, the food isn't what you're rejecting." The entire dining room held its breath. Nathan Callaway looked up, slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, someone had made him feel something other than numb. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart before it puts it back together. The hostess at Meridian Restaurant had a private name for Table 14. She called it the Ghost Table. Not because anything supernatural had ever happened there, not because the chair was crooked or the lighting was dim. She called it that because for 3 years running, every single Thursday, without exception, rain or snow or holiday weekend, the same man sat alone at that corner table and made the entire room feel slightly colder than it actually was. His name was Nathan Callaway, and he was the kind of man who made other people lower their voices when he walked in. He was 32 years old, but looked, depending on the light, somewhere between 28 and 45. Dark hair, always cut clean, but never styled like he cared about it. Eyes the color of deep water. A gray-green that didn't invite conversation. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, but he wore them the way other men wore old hoodies. Automatically, without thought, like the clothes had simply appeared on his body, and he hadn't noticed. He had built his first tech company at 24 out of a studio apartment with 2 programmers and a whiteboard. By 27, he had sold it for $340 million, reinvested everything into logistics infrastructure, and by 30, he had crossed the billion threshold twice over. Forbes had called him relentless. Fortune had called him visionary. His employees privately called him the machine. None of that mattered to him. None of it had mattered for 3 years. What mattered, what he kept coming back to every Thursday night, was Table 14 and the empty chair across from him. Meridian was one of those restaurants that understood its clientele was paying for the feeling of being somewhere important. The ceilings were 20 feet high. The lighting was amber and deliberate. The menu changed seasonally and used words like deconstructed and foraged and hand-pulled without irony. A reservation normally required a 6-week wait unless your name carried enough weight to bend the usual rules. Nathan Callaway's name bent every rule. He arrived at 7:45 every Thursday. He was always alone. He always requested the same table, corner, facing the room, back to the wall, and he always ordered a full dinner, appetizer, main, dessert, wine, pairing. He never looked at the menu because he'd long since memorized it, and he changed his order every week, methodically working through the offerings with the kind of systematic approach he applied to quarterly earnings reports. And every single week, he sent it all back. Not with cruelty, not with complaint. He would watch the plates arrive, look at the food for a long moment with an expression the servers had stopped trying to interpret, and then say quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm not hungry tonight." The food went back to the kitchen untouched. He left a tip that was never less than $400. Then he was gone by 9:30, and the table felt less like a corner of an upscale restaurant and more like the site of something private and unfinished. The kitchen staff had theories. The manager, a precise man named Gerald Holt, had stopped trying to figure it out after the first year. "He pays," Gerald would say, whenever new staff asked questions. "He tips better than anyone in this city. You leave him alone." So they left him alone. Until Emma Carter. Emma Carter arrived at Meridian on a Tuesday in late October, not through the front door, but through the service entrance on Merchant Street, because she was 7 minutes late and didn't want Gerald to see her come in through the lobby. She failed. He was standing directly inside the back corridor with his clipboard and his reading glasses pushed down his nose, and he gave her the look that she had already memorized in her first 2 weeks. Carter. I know. The 6 train, he said, is not a new development in this city. Please adjust accordingly." "Yes, sir." She was already tying her apron. "It won't happen again." It would happen again. They both knew it. The 6 train was chronically unreliable between her stop in the Bronx in Midtown, and Emma couldn't afford to live closer to work. And that was just the arithmetic of her life, the kind of math that didn't care about your intentions. She was 30 years old, but she had the kind of eyes that had seen enough to be 15 years older. Dark brown and alert and observant in a way that wasn't quite wariness, but was adjacent to it. She was average height, not thin. With dark hair she kept pulled back on shift because the health code required it, and she didn't have time in the morning to style it anyway. Her uniform fit like it had been made for someone slightly taller, and she'd never gotten around to having it altered because alterations cost money, and money was the thing her life was constantly just barely running out of. She was good at her job. That much was undisputed, even by Gerald, who dispensed compliments with the generosity of a man rationing food during a siege. She remembered orders without writing them down when tables were small enough. She read people quickly, knew within 30 seconds whether a couple was celebrating or fighting, whether a business dinner was going well or catastrophically, whether a solo diner wanted to be left alone or quietly acknowledged. She had learned this skill not in any restaurant training program, but in 20 years of navigating a life where reading the room correctly was sometimes the difference between a good night and a very bad one. She had grown up poor, which was not a tragedy but was a fact, and facts shaped you whether you wanted them to or not. Her mother had cleaned offices downtown. Her father had left when Emma was 4 and occasionally resurfaced when he needed something, which she had long since stopped providing. She had put herself through 2 years of community college before the money ran out, worked restaurant jobs since she was 16, and had spent most of her 20s in a cycle of work and survival that didn't leave a lot of room for anything else. She'd had a good job once, a real one, assistant manager at a mid-range restaurant group in Brooklyn, salaried, with benefits, and a small team she'd actually cared about. She'd been there 4 years and had been 2 months away from a promotion to regional coordinator when she discovered that the general manager had been skimming wages. Not dramatically, just quietly, systematically, $5 to $15 per paycheck per employee, which over 2 years and 43 staff members had added up to something close to $180,000. She'd reported it, done everything right, gone to HR, then to the ownership group, put everything in writing, kept copies. She'd been fired 3 weeks later. The general manager, who was, she later found out, the owner's brother-in-law, received a quiet internal censure and a transfer to another location. Emma received a severance check that covered exactly 1 month's rent and a reference letter so carefully worded it said nothing. That had been 2.5 years ago. She'd spent the time since rebuilding, slowly, carefully, working shifts wherever she could get them while the industry whisper network decided whether she was a troublemaker or a person of principle. Meridian had been the first place in 18 months to give her a full-time schedule, and she was not going to blow it by being late again. Or so she told herself every Tuesday morning when the 6 train was 17 minutes delayed. She learned about Nathan Calloway on her 3rd shift. She was rolling silverware during pre-service when Diane, a veteran server who had worked at Meridian for 11 years and possessed the institutional knowledge of a military historian, sat down across from her and said, "You're going to end up with table 14 eventually. You should know the rules." Emma looked up. "There are rules?" "There's one rule." Diane set down a knife and fork with the precision of someone who had wrapped approximately 40,000 sets of silverware and had opinions about the correct technique. You don't ask him anything personal. You don't comment on the food coming back. You say, "Of course, sir." You collect the plate, and you walk away. "Who is he?" "Nathan Calloway." Diane said the name the way you'd say the name of a weather system, like it was a thing that happened to you rather than a person you might interact with. Tech money, logistics money, old money by now. Worth, I don't know, a lot. His wife died 3 years ago, January, I think. Aneurysm. She was 29. Emma's hand stopped moving. "He comes every Thursday," Diane continued. 7:45, same table, orders dinner, sends it back. Tips $400 minimum, sometimes more. Gerald thinks he comes because the restaurant reminds him of her somehow. They used to come together before she died. Marcus in the kitchen thinks he comes because he doesn't want to be alone in that house with his daughter and the quiet. Diane shrugged. "Nobody really knows. Point is, you don't try to find out." "He has a daughter?" 7 years old, Sophie. Sometimes he brings her on Friday nights instead. When she comes, he actually eats. That's the other thing. When the kid is there, he's different, less like a statue. Emma thought about this for a moment. So he sends the food back every week and nobody has ever said anything? No. Diane gave her a look that was not unkind but was firm. We're not therapists, we're servers. Gerald has made that very clear. Emma nodded slowly and went back to rolling silverware. She told herself she understood the rule. She was good at following rules she agreed with, and she could see the logic of this one. The man was grieving. He was a major source of revenue for the restaurant, and his private pain was his own business. She told herself this. And then, 6 days later, on a Thursday night in early November, Gerald assigned her table 14. She saw him before he sat down. He came through the front entrance at 7:43, paused to hand his coat to the coat check with a nod that was polite but impersonal, and then moved through the room with the particular walk of a person who was used to having space made for them. Not aggressive, just certain. He knew where he was going, and the room rearranged itself accordingly. He was taller than she'd expected. The gray-green eyes were exactly as described. The suit was charcoal, the tie was loosened slightly, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that she recognized immediately, the way you recognized a color you'd seen before without being able to name it. That was the weight of someone who had stopped expecting the day to get better. She knew that posture. She'd worn it herself for most of the year after the Brooklyn job. He sat down at table 14 without looking at the menu. He looked, instead, at the empty chair across from him, just briefly, 2, maybe 3 seconds, before redirecting his gaze to the middle distance beyond the room's eastern windows. Emma approached. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Emma. I'll be taking care of you tonight." He looked at her. Not rudely. Not the dismissive scan that some wealthy clients performed, measuring your worth in a single glance. He just looked, the way someone looks when they're trying to decide whether a thing is going to require their attention or not. "Emma," he said. His voice was low and even. "Fine. Can I start you with something from the bar?" "Sparkling water, and I'll order now." "I know what I want." She took the order. He'd chosen the pan-seared halibut with the autumn vegetable ragu, started with the roasted beet salad, and selected a 2019 white burgundy from the wine list without pausing. She wrote it down, habit, even though she had it, and went to put it in. Marcus, the head chef, raised an eyebrow when he saw the ticket. "Callaway?" "Apparently." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "I'll plate it clean. He never touches it anyway, but I plate it clean." Emma watched from the service station as the first course went out, delivered by the food runner since she was managing 3 other tables, and watched Nathan Callaway look at the beet salad the way someone might look at a photograph they weren't sure they wanted to see. He didn't touch it. When it was time to clear, she went herself. "Was everything all right with the salad?" She kept her voice neutral. "Fine." He set his water glass down. "I'm just not hungry yet." She nodded and collected the plate. The main course went the same way. She brought it out herself this time, but the halibut was beautifully plated. Marcus had clearly taken care, and set it before him. He looked at it, a long look, the same kind of look he'd given the empty chair. 5 minutes later, he hadn't moved. She came back. "Mr. Callaway, is there anything I can—" "I'm not hungry," he said. "You can take it." She should have said, "Of course, sir." She should have collected the plate and walked away. That was the rule, and she had agreed with the rule, and for 29 days she had been following it carefully. Instead, she heard herself say, "It's not the food, is it?" Not a question. She'd said it as a statement, quietly, and immediately wanted to pull the words back out of the air. The silence that followed was approximately the longest 5 seconds of her professional life. Nathan Callaway turned his head and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, or not anger, not surprise, something more complicated than either. "Excuse me?" he said. She'd already gone this far. Backing up now would just be worse. "The food," she said carefully. "You order it every week. You send it back every week. The kitchen plates it well. Marcus is good. He takes care. But the issue isn't what's on the plate." She paused. "You're rejecting something else." The ambient noise of the restaurant continued around them. Soft piano from the bar area, the murmur of 24 conversations, the clink of glasses. But table 14 felt sealed off from all of it. "You've worked here 3 weeks," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Almost 4. And in almost 4 weeks, you've decided you understand something about me that no one else has bothered to name." "I haven't decided anything," she said, and she was aware that her voice was steadier than she actually felt, which was nervous in a way that went all the way down. The food isn't the problem, that's all I'm saying." He looked at her for another long moment. She held the plate and didn't move. "What would you bring me," he said finally, slowly, "if you were feeding someone you actually cared about?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to go there. She'd expected anger or dismissal or a request to speak with Gerald. She thought about it honestly. "Soup," she said. "Something with real broth, not reconstructed stock. Bread that's been baked that day, not warmed up from yesterday. Something that doesn't perform. Something that just is what it is." He was quiet. "We don't have that on the menu," he said. "No," she agreed. "We don't." Another pause. "What's your name again?" "Emma. Emma Carter." "Emma Carter." He said her name as if he was filing it. "Bring me whatever the kitchen has that comes closest to what you just described. Use your judgment." She almost said that's not really how this works, and then didn't, because clearly they had already left the territory of how things normally worked, and were now somewhere else entirely. "I'll see what I can do," she said. She went to the kitchen and found Marcus breaking down a stock pot. "I need something that isn't on the menu," she said. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who had been in kitchens for 23 years and had heard this sentence more times than he could count, in every possible tone. "Define something." "Broth. Real broth. Bread that was actually made today. Something simple." He stared at her. "For Calloway?" "Yes." Marcus put down his ladle. He looked at the door to the dining room. He looked at Emma. He looked at the ceiling, the way people do when they're doing math they didn't expect to have to do. "I've got a mushroom and thyme consommé I made this afternoon for tomorrow's tasting menu," he said. "It's not... Is it good?" A pause. "Yeah, it's good. Is the bread from today?" "The sourdough, yes. We did 3 loaves for the bread service. There's 1 left. Can you pull a bowl of the consommé and cut that bread and butter it properly?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was hard to read, something between respect and concern, which she recognized as the expression of someone watching another person walk confidently in a direction that might be a cliff. "You know what you're doing?" he said. "Not entirely," she said honestly. "But I think he needs to actually eat tonight." Marcus said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his stove. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. The consommé was dark and clear, the kind of broth that smells like something important, like someone's grandmother made it with time and attention and didn't hurry it. The bread was thick-sliced, the butter was soft, and there was nothing decorative about any of it. It looked like exactly what it was, food. Emma carried it out herself. She set it down before Nathan Calloway without ceremony. He looked at it. A long look, the same long look, but this time something in his face moved. Some small shift barely visible in the muscles around his eyes. "This is from the menu?" he said. "No." He looked up at her. "Chef Marcus is testing a consommé for the tasting menu," she said. He wanted a second opinion. It was a mild fiction, and she suspected he knew it. But he looked back at the bowl and said nothing, and she stepped back to give him space. She didn't watch him. She went to her other tables, checked on the couple in the corner, who were on what appeared to be a second or third date, and were leaning toward each other at an angle that meant things were going well, refilled water glasses at table 9, delivered a dessert to table 6. When she came back past table 14 7 minutes later, the bowl was empty. Not scraped. He hadn't scooped it dramatically or made any show of it. The bowl was simply empty, the bread was gone, and Nathan Calloway was sitting with his hands folded on the table, looking at the empty chair across from him with an expression that was still sad but was somehow no longer quite so sealed. He looked up when she approached. "That was good," he said. His voice was slightly different. Not warmer exactly, but less armored. I'll tell Marcus, she said. She collected the bowl. Can I get you anything else? Coffee? Dessert? He shook his head. Then he said, Emma. She stopped. Thank you, he said. For not... He paused, looking for the word. For saying the true thing. She nodded once. Have a good evening, Mr. Calloway. She walked back to the kitchen. Marcus was watching her through the pass-through window with an expression she had never seen on him before. The expression of a man who has just witnessed something he didn't expect and isn't sure what to do with the information. Empty bowl, so? He said. Empty bowl, she confirmed. He turned back to his station. After a moment, he said quietly, not quite to her, in 11 years. That's the first time. Emma filed that information away and went back to work. He left at 9:15 instead of 9:30. The tip was $600. Gerald found Emma before she left for the night, catching her at the coat check in the kind of tone he used when he was trying to decide whether to be angry or not. Calloway, he said. Yes. You went off menu. Marcus offered. I know what Marcus offered. Marcus told me. Gerald looked at her over his reading glasses. Do you understand why we don't do that? Why the rule exists? Emma thought about lying. She was good at it when she needed to be, but it was expensive. It cost something each time, and she'd already spent a lot that way. Because it's not our place to try to fix what's wrong with him, she said. I understand that. And yet he hadn't eaten in there in 3 years, she said. And tonight he did. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He was a complicated man. She'd figured that out early. Not unkind, but cautious. The way people become cautious when they've been managing other people's crises for a long time. He picked up information and held it carefully before deciding what to do with it. He's asked to be seated in your section next Thursday, Gerald said. Emma blinked. He called? She said. He called. Gerald took his glasses off and cleaned them with the deliberateness of someone buying time. I'm not a therapist and neither are you, and this is a restaurant, not a grief counseling center. You understand that? Yes. The food goes back, you don't comment. That's the standing order. Understood. But apparently, Gerald said, replacing his glasses, we're going to see how Thursday goes. He walked away. Emma stood at the coat check for a moment in the quiet of the nearly empty restaurant and thought about a man sitting at a table across from an empty chair, ordering food he didn't eat for 3 years. She thought about what it meant to keep showing up to a ritual that was slowly killing you because stopping it felt like a second death. She had done a version of that herself. After Brooklyn, she had gone back to the same coffee shop where she and her former colleagues used to debrief after bad shifts, had gone back for 3 months before she realized she wasn't going there for coffee. She was going there to grieve something she didn't know how to name. She understood the logic of Table 14 better than she'd let on to Diane, or to Marcus, or to Gerald. She understood it because she knew what it looked like when someone was refusing not the food, but the fact that life had continued moving without their permission. She put on her coat. Outside, it had started to rain. Not dramatically, just the thin, persistent drizzle that settled over Manhattan in early November like a second atmosphere. She pulled up her hood and walked toward the subway, thinking about soup and bread and the particular sound a bowl makes when it's been emptied by someone who finally decided to eat. The following Friday, he brought his daughter. Emma wasn't assigned to that section. She was on the west side of the room that night, working a private party of 12, but she saw them come in from across the floor, and she stopped for a moment without meaning to. The little girl was 7, as Diane had said, with her father's dark hair and someone else's brightness, an open face, curious eyes, the kind of energy that is always slightly in advance of the body containing it. She was wearing a purple dress that was slightly too formal for a Friday dinner and completely right for the occasion of being 7 years old and out for dinner with her father. She was talking the entire time they walked to the table. Emma couldn't hear the words from across the room, but she could see the shape of them, the animated gestures, the way the girl tugged her father's hand to point at something on the wall, the way she climbed into her chair and immediately began examining the breadbasket with serious scientific interest. Nathan Calloway sat across from his daughter and looked at her with an expression Emma hadn't seen on him at table 14. He looked like someone who was still in pain but had found, in the presence of this particular 7-year-old, a reason to set it down temporarily. He ordered dinner. He ate it. Emma watched this from across the room while she poured wine for a table of pharmaceutical executives and kept her face professionally neutral and thought about the arithmetic of grief, about how the same man who couldn't swallow a bite of food alone could, in the presence of his daughter, remember how to be hungry. Later, at the end of service, she was collecting linen from the west tables when she became aware of someone standing approximately 4 feet to her left, and she turned to find Nathan Calloway's daughter, looking up at her with the expression of someone who has decided to investigate. "Hi," said the girl. "Hi," said Emma. "Are you the one who made my dad eat the soup?" Emma folded the linen slowly. "Who told you that?" "My dad." The girl looked at her with steady, serious eyes. "He said someone at the restaurant figured something out and made him eat." She paused. "He didn't tell me your name." "Emma," Emma said. "Emma Carter." The girl considered this. "I'm Sophie." "I know, your dad talks about you." He hadn't, not explicitly, but she felt this was true in a structural sense. She'd inferred Sophie from the shape of Nathan Calloway's silences, the way he looked at the empty chair as if trying to calculate what it had contained. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. She looked at the breadbasket Emma was clearing. "Is there any of that soup left?" Sophie said. Emma looked at her. "It was from last week." "Oh." Sophie considered this philosophical problem. "Could there be soup again sometime?" "I'll talk to the chef," Emma said. "Okay." Sophie turned to go, then turned back, the way 7-year-olds do when they've remembered something important. "Emma?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for making my dad eat." She said it very directly, the way children say serious things, without ceremony, which made them hit harder. "He forgets sometimes." Emma stayed very still for a moment. "I'll remind him," she said, "when I can." Sophie nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her father's table. Emma stood there for another second, holding an armful of linen, and then she went back to work. He came back the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. The dynamic settled into something that was not quite ritual and not quite friendship, but occupied a territory between them that didn't have a clean name. Emma managed his table when she was assigned to that section. She brought the off-menu consommé when Marcus had it. He kept making it, quietly, without being asked, every Thursday. And occasionally she brought other things, a small plate of cheese and fruit, a bowl of whatever the kitchen had made for staff meal, if it was good. Simple things. Food that didn't perform. Nathan Calloway ate. Not always enthusiastically, not always completely, but he ate. He also, gradually, began to talk. Not confessionally, not the way people talk to therapists or to bartenders in bad movies. He talked the way people who are not accustomed to talking about themselves talk, carefully, peripherally, approaching things from the side. He mentioned Sophie and her new obsession with astronomy. She had decided she wanted to be an astrophysicist, and he had bought her a telescope and spent 3 weekends trying to figure out how to set it up. "Did you get it working?" Emma asked, refilling his water. "Eventually. We saw Saturn." A pause. She screamed. Good screaming or bad screaming? Absolute delight screaming. And there it was. The thing she'd seen at the Friday table when Sophie was there, that brief opening in the armor. He smiled. It was small and slightly asymmetrical and looked like it still cost him something. She made me come back outside at 2 in the morning because she was convinced the ring would be different if we looked again. Was it? No, but she was right that it was worth looking again. Emma smiled at her notepad. "I'll leave you to it," she said. She was halfway back to the service station when she heard him say, quietly enough that she wasn't entirely sure she was meant to hear it, "She has her mother's certainty." Emma kept walking. She understood that some things were set into the air and not to any particular person, and the right response was to let them be. It was in December, 6 weeks into their irregular Thursday conversation, that Emma started to notice something was wrong with the restaurant's accounting. She hadn't been looking for it. She wasn't auditing anything. She was in the break room one evening before service, looking for the staff schedule that was supposedly posted on the employee board, when she found instead a payroll printout that had been left face up on the counter next to the coffee machine. She'd almost walked past it. What stopped her was the name at the top of the column, Diane. She knew Diane's hours because they worked the same shifts 3 days a week, and the number on that printout was wrong. Not dramatically, not so wrong that it would scream at you if you weren't paying attention, but wrong by enough that Emma, who had grown up budgeting very carefully and knew the difference between $5 and $4.50 at the level of the body, noticed it immediately. She stood in the break room for a moment and did the math in her head. Then she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she should do with what she'd accidentally found. She put the printout back where she'd found it and went out to set up her section. But she didn't stop thinking about it. She thought about it through the appetizer course and the main course and the Thursday night rush and the long, slow stretch of the final seating. She thought about it on the subway home, the 6th train rattling through the dark tunnel beneath the East River. And she thought about it at 2 in the morning when she should have been sleeping. She thought about the $180,000 that had been quietly stolen from 43 people in Brooklyn, and about the reference letter that said nothing, and about 18 months of rebuilding. She thought about what it would cost her to be right about this, and what it would cost the people she worked alongside if she was right, and said nothing. The arithmetic of that problem was not complicated. It was just very, very expensive. On the following Tuesday, she stayed after her shift and asked Marcus casually about his paycheck, framed as a question about whether the payment schedule was weekly or bi-weekly, since she was trying to plan her finances. Marcus told her. The number he mentioned was lower than the rate on the staff scheduling sheet, the one with the hourly rates that was posted on the employee board and had been there since Emma's first week. Not by a lot, by enough. She went home and lay in the dark and thought about the fact that she worked in a restaurant owned by Nathan Calloway, who tipped $600 because a bowl of soup had moved him, and who she had come, over the past 6 weeks, to see as something more complicated and more human than the ghost that haunted Table 14. She thought about what it meant to trust someone with something that could blow up your life. She thought about Brooklyn. She stayed very still for a long time. Then she got up, made herself a cup of tea she didn't really want, and sat at her kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn of a Wednesday morning and began writing down everything she had noticed, in the careful, precise way she had learned to document things the first time. Dates, amounts, names, the location of the payroll printout, the discrepancy between posted rates and the amounts Marcus had described. She wrote it all down. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it, but she knew that not writing it down was the first step toward pretending she hadn't seen it, and she had learned, the hard way, that pretending not to see things had a cost that you paid later, in the dark, in ways that were harder to calculate than wage theft, but no less real. She worked the next 3 Thursdays without saying anything. The holidays were approaching. The restaurant was decorated, the menus had shifted to winter offerings, the reservation book was completely full through January. There were 3 new staff members in training. Gerald was more tense than usual, which meant he spoke in shorter sentences and his clipboard never left his hand. Nathan Calloway came every Thursday. He ate. Not always the soup. Marcus had quietly begun keeping a small repertoire of simple off-menu things for Table 14, and Emma varied what she brought depending on what the kitchen had and what her instinct told her about what he needed. She was calibrating him the way you calibrate anything complex, gradually, with attention, adjusting for variables. One Thursday evening in December, with snow threatening outside and the restaurant warm and crowded, she brought him a plate of braised short rib that Marcus had made for the staff meal, served simply, on white china, without garnish. He looked at it. "This is different," he said. "Kitchen made extra tonight." He ate half of it. Then he set his fork down and looked at her with the direct, measuring gaze he used when he was going to say something he'd been thinking about. "How long have you worked in restaurants?" he said. "Since I was 16. That's," he did the math, 14 years. Give or take. "You're not a career server?" he said. It wasn't rude. It was observation. "You could manage a place like this." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I did, once. A different place." "What happened?" She looked at him. She weighed the question, not defensively, not evasively, but with the specific weight of someone who has told this story a number of times, and each time has had to decide how much truth to put in it. "I found out the manager was stealing from the staff," she said. "I reported it. I lost my job. Something shifted in Nathan Calloway's expression. The owner protected him? He said. The owner was his brother-in-law. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said, and it was the particular kind of I'm sorry that means more than condolence, the kind that recognizes that something unfair happened to a person. Emma nodded once. She almost said something then, about Meridian, about Gerald, about the payroll printout and the numbers she'd been writing in her notebook. She didn't, not yet. The thought was there, almost formed, almost said, but she held it back because she wasn't ready, because she was still calculating, because she had learned at significant personal cost that the difference between the right moment and the wrong one could be everything. She went back to work, but the story was already moving. The weight of what she knew had been in her chest for 3 weeks, and it was getting heavier, and she understood that you could only carry something like that for so long before it became the only thing you were carrying. Outside, the snow had started. Nathan Calloway sat at table 14 and ate half of his braised short rib and looked at the empty chair across from him, and for the first time, Emma thought, he looked less like a man visiting a grave and more like a man who had begun, slowly and with great difficulty, to find his way back to the living. She was glad for him. She was also terrified of what she was about to do to the fragile thing they had built, when the time finally came to tell him the truth. The snow that had threatened on that last Thursday in December followed through on its promise sometime around midnight, and by morning, Manhattan was wearing the particular kind of quiet that only comes when the city has been temporarily muffled under 6 inches of white. Emma walked to the subway in boots that were not quite waterproof and told herself that January would be better, financially and otherwise, and mostly believed it. She had spent the holiday week working double shifts because the money was good and because her apartment was small and the walls had a way of pressing in on her when she had too much time to think. She had also spent it adding to the notebook, carefully, methodically, the way she'd learned to document things when she understood that memory alone was not enough and that the people who came after you with lawyers asked for paper. The numbers didn't get better the more she looked at them. If anything, they got worse, because once she started paying attention, she started noticing things she'd initially dismissed as her own miscalculation. The posted hourly rates on the employee board, the amounts in the informal payroll summary she'd found a second time, again left carelessly on the break room counter, this time next to a stack of December invoices. The gap between what Marcus had mentioned and what the sheet said. She'd found 2 other staff members she trusted enough to ask, framed always as a question about budgeting or tax withholding, and each time the number she heard was slightly lower than what it should have been. Not dramatically, never dramatically. That was the art of it. Small enough that any single discrepancy could be explained. Large enough that if you multiplied it across a full staff in a full year, it became something significant. It became something intentional. Gerald Holt's name was on the payroll processing paperwork. She'd seen that too, his signature at the bottom of the December summary, neat and precise, like everything else about him. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do with all of it. She told herself she was still gathering information. She told herself she needed to be certain before she moved, that the cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of being slow. She told herself a lot of things in January while the snow melted and froze again, and the restaurant filled up with people escaping the cold, and Nathan Calloway came every Thursday and ate, and Sophie came on alternate Fridays and talked about astrophysics with the intensity of someone who had decided the universe owed her an explanation. Emma liked Sophie with the uncomplicated directness that you like someone who has no artifice in them yet, who says what she thinks and means what she says and hasn't learned yet that the world sometimes punishes you for both. She was a strange kid in the best way, simultaneously 7 years old and approximately 45, capable of spending 15 minutes describing the atmospheric composition of Jupiter and then becoming completely undone because the breadbasket was empty. "Can I have more bread?" Sophie asked one Friday evening in January, looking at Emma with the direct appeal of someone who had identified the correct person to ask. "I'll check with the kitchen," Emma said. "Last time the kitchen said they were out, but then Marcus brought some anyway." "That's because you asked Marcus directly, and he can't say no to you." Sophie considered this. "Is that a power?" "It's absolutely a power," Emma said. "Use it wisely." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the children's menu she was annotating in the margins with what appeared to be calculations. Emma had learned not to ask what the calculations were because the answer always took longer than she had, and also because she usually couldn't follow it after the first 40 seconds. Nathan watched this exchange with the expression he'd been wearing more often lately. Not the sealed, armored look of the man who had come to Meridian for 3 years to not eat dinner, but something more open and more tired-looking, which was, paradoxically, better. Tired meant present. Tired meant he was actually living his days instead of moving through them on autopilot. "She's explaining her theory about dark matter to her teacher," he said, when Sophie was absorbed in her margin calculations. "Her teacher sent me an email. The subject line was, 'Your daughter.' Was that good or bad?" "Unclear. The email itself was mostly impressed, I think, but also slightly alarmed." He paused. "She told the class that most of what we know about the universe is wrong." "Is she incorrect?" He looked at Emma. "Apparently not, which is the part the teacher found alarming." Emma smiled. She refilled his water and was about to move to the next table when he said, "She talks about you." She stopped. "At home," he said. "She mentions you." "Emma at the restaurant. She asked me last week if you had a telescope." "I don't." "I told her that. She said you should get one." He paused. "She said Saturn is worth looking at." Emma held her water pitcher and thought about a 7-year-old with her father's dark hair and someone else's certainty, and about the particular weight of being told by a child that something was worth your time. "Tell her I'll consider it," Emma said. She went to check on table 9 and didn't let herself think too hard about any of it. She was getting better at that, at not thinking too hard about the exact nature of what was developing between herself and the Callaways, père et fille, at table 14 and table 14 on Fridays. It didn't fit cleanly into any category she had a name for. It wasn't a friendship exactly, though it had the texture of one. It wasn't professional distance, though she maintained the forms of that. It was something in between, something that had grown out of a bowl of consommé and a 7-word sentence and 6 weeks of Thursday nights, and which she suspected was more fragile than it looked. She was aware that part of what made it fragile was the thing she was carrying in her notebook. The problem with what she knew, with what she was increasingly certain she knew, was that Gerald Holt was not some anonymous manager at a mid-range Brooklyn restaurant group. Gerald Holt was the general manager of Meridian, which was owned by the Callaway hospitality arm, which was ultimately Nathan Callaway's money. And Nathan Callaway was the man who sat at table 14 every Thursday and had, over the past 2 months, gone from a man who couldn't eat to a man who sometimes ordered dessert. If she brought this to him, she was asking him to investigate his own restaurant. She was asking him to trust her read on a situation where she'd been wrong before. Not wrong, actually. She'd been right before and punished for it. Where she had a history that someone could use to make her look like she had an agenda. She was also, and this was the part that kept her up at night, potentially blowing up the one job in the city that was currently paying her rent and building something that might eventually resemble a stable life. The arithmetic of doing the right thing had never once, in Emma Carter's experience, been simple. She worked through January telling herself she'd figure it out, and in February she finally acknowledged that what she was doing was not figuring it out, but waiting for someone else to make the decision for her, which was not a strategy she respected in other people and liked even less in herself. She made the decision on a Tuesday, in the second week of February, in the break room when she found Paulina, 23 years old, 2 years at Meridian, sending money home to her mother in Queens every month, counting her paycheck with the careful, tense focus of someone for whom the number on that paper determined whether several other numbers added up or didn't. Emma watched Paulina count. She saw Paulina's face change, the small tightening around the eyes that meant the number wasn't right. She watched Paulina count again. And then Paulina looked up and saw Emma watching her, and something passed between them that didn't require language. "Is yours off too?" Emma said. Paulina was quiet for a moment. She was weighing something. Emma recognized the weight. "A little," Paulina said carefully. "I thought maybe I miscounted my hours." "Did you?" Another pause. Longer. "No," Paulina said. "I don't think I did." Emma sat down across from her. "How long?" Emma said. Paulina looked at her hands. "Since August. Maybe before that. I thought... She stopped. I needed this job. I still need this job. I know, Emma said. I know you do. They sat there for a moment in the break room, with the sounds of pre-service filtering in from the kitchen, Marcus calling out instructions, the particular clatter of a professional kitchen getting ready to perform. I have documentation, Emma said. I've been keeping records since December. If you want to add yours... What are you going to do with it? Paulina said. Emma thought about Gerald's signature at the bottom of the payroll sheet. She thought about Brooklyn and the letter that said nothing. She thought about Nathan Calloway at table 14, eating soup for the first time in 3 years because someone told him the truth. I'm going to take it to the owner, she said. Paulina stared at her. Calloway? Yes. You know him, Paulina said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it had weight. He sits in your section. He sits in my section, Emma agreed. That's not the same as knowing what he'll do. Paulina looked at her hands again. She looked at her paycheck. She looked at Emma. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? What Emma needed from her was dates and amounts and the willingness to be honest about what she'd noticed. And Paulina gave her all three in the careful, specific way of someone who also understood that memory was not enough, that you needed the details written down where someone could look at them. Over the following week, Emma talked to 3 more people. Marcus, Diane, a prep cook named Rolando who had worked at Meridian for 4 years and whose face, when Emma raised the subject, went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and something that looked like relief, like a pressure valve finally opening. 5 people, 5 sets of numbers, a combined discrepancy across all of them that Emma calculated conservatively at somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 over the past year alone. She sat with that number for 2 days. Then she called Nathan Calloway. She had his number because he'd given it to her 3 weeks earlier, not romantically, not with any particular significance that she'd been able to identify at the time, but practically. Sophie had been asking about a specific species of star cluster she'd seen in a library book, and Emma had mentioned that she'd read something about it during a slow shift, and he'd said, "Text me the source when you find it," and had given her his number. She had sent him a link to an astronomy journal article, and he had replied with a thank you emoji, which she had found oddly endearing from a man worth $4.2 billion. She texted him now. "I need to speak with you privately, not at the restaurant. It's about something I've found that I think you need to know." She sent it and put her phone face down on her kitchen table and made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink. He replied in 11 minutes. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. My office. I'll send you the address." She said yes and spent the rest of the evening going over her documentation one more time, checking every figure, every date, every name, making sure the story the numbers told was the story she believed, and not the story she wanted to be true or the story she was afraid of. The address he sent was a building in Midtown that she walked past twice before she found the entrance, because the lobby was understated in the way that very serious money is sometimes understated. No signage, dark glass, a doorman who looked like he had opinions about who belonged there. She gave her name and he called upstairs, and she rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, feeling the particular feeling of someone who has made a decision they believe is right and is about to find out if the world agrees. Nathan Calloway's office was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something colder, perhaps. Something more explicitly designed to demonstrate power. What she got was a room with a lot of natural light and too many papers on every surface, and a wall of windows looking out over Midtown that would have been dramatic if anyone had clearly taken time to stage it, but which instead was draped in the particular randomness of a space where a lot of actual work happened. A framed drawing was propped against the window ledge, crayon, clearly by Sophie, depicting what might have been Saturn or might have been an egg with a hat. He was standing when she came in, not sitting behind the desk in the way that would have been a power move, just standing near the window with his coffee cup looking at her with the same direct measuring gaze she'd catalogued over 2 months of Thursdays. "Emma," he said. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "Sit down." He gestured at the chairs in front of the desk. He pulled the second one around so they were both facing the window rather than across the desk from each other, which she registered and appreciated. A small architectural decision that said, "I'm not here to interrogate you." She sat. She put her folder on her knee. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She told it the way she'd rehearsed it, chronologically, specifically, without editorializing. The payroll printout in December, the staff conversations, the 5 people, the dates, the amounts. She laid the documentation on the desk page by page as she went, and he read each page with the focused, rapid attention of someone who understood numbers and was already running the implications while she was still explaining the premise. He didn't interrupt. She had expected him to interrupt, to question, to push back, to say, "Are you sure?" in the tone that meant, "I need you to be wrong about this." He didn't. He read and listened, and his face did a thing she'd seen it do before, which was become very still when he was processing something that cost him. When she finished, the folder was empty and the pages were on the desk between them. He looked at them for a moment. "You said 5 people," he said. "Yes." "These 5 gave you their information directly, willingly?" "Yes." 3 of them had already noticed something was off. 2 of them thought they'd miscounted their hours. He was quiet. He picked up one of the pages, Diane's, the one with the longest history of discrepancy, and looked at it again. "Gerald's been with this property for 9 years, he said. It wasn't a defense. It was the tone of someone doing the math on how long a thing had been happening that they didn't know about. "I know," Emma said. "I didn't know." He said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it loudly. "This has been happening in my restaurant for—" He looked at the dates on the pages. "Minimum 14 months, probably longer." "Probably longer," Emma agreed. He set the page down. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. "Why did you bring this to me?" he said. "Why not? The labor board. An attorney. There are other options." She had prepared for this question. "Because I work in your restaurant," she said. "Because the people whose money is being stolen work in your restaurant. Because if I went to an external body first, the investigation takes months, and everyone involved spends those months in uncertainty, and Gerald knows something is coming and has time to construct a story." She paused. "And because I thought you would do something about it." He looked at her. "You thought that," he said. "Yes. Based on 2 months of soup." She almost smiled, but it wasn't the moment for it. "Based on what I've observed," she said. "Which is more than soup." He didn't respond to that directly. He looked at the pages on the desk again, and then he looked at the window, and Emma watched him in profile. The specific set of his jaw that she'd learned meant he was thinking hard and didn't want to talk yet. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd spent 20 years learning to let other people arrive at things on their own schedule. "You know what happened to you in Brooklyn?" he said finally. "Yes." "And you're still bringing this to me." "Someone has to," she said. "That's always been the problem. Someone has to bring it to someone." He looked at her then. A long, direct look, the kind that doesn't have social softening in it. "I need a few days," he said. "I want my financial team to look at the full payroll history before I move. I want this to be airtight." He paused. "Can you not mention this to anyone else at the restaurant for now? Not because I need to protect Gerald. I don't. But because if it gets back to him before I have the complete picture, he has time to alter records." "I haven't told anyone I was bringing it to you," Emma said. "I just said I was looking into it." "Good." He started gathering the pages. "I'm going to need copies of all of this." "Those are copies," she said. "I kept the originals." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but the adjacent thing, the expression of someone recalibrating. "You've done this before," he said. "Not just, you know how this works." "I know how it goes wrong," she said, "so I try to prepare for that." He nodded slowly. She stood to go. At the door she stopped because he said her name. Not sharply, just to stop her. "Emma." She turned. "This took something," he said. "Bringing this here. I know it did." She held his gaze for a moment. "So did taking it from me," she said. "Thank you for that." She left. On the elevator down, she stood very still and breathed slowly and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the specific terror of having done it again, of having put the true thing in front of a powerful person and trusted them to handle it correctly. The last time she'd done that, she'd lost everything. She walked out onto the Midtown sidewalk into a cold February morning and told herself that people were not all the same, that circumstances were not predetermined, that the fact that something had gone one way before did not mean it would go the same way again. She walked to the subway and tried to believe that. She was mostly successful. The days that followed had the quality of held breath. She worked her shifts. She served her tables. She brought Nathan Calloway his Thursday dinner, a simple beef and root vegetable braise that Marcus had made with the quiet care he'd been bringing to table 14 for months, and he ate it without mentioning the conversation in his office, and she didn't bring it up. The understanding between them had the specific texture of two people who have established trust in one domain and are choosing not to let anxiety about another domain contaminate it. Sophie came on Friday with a new book about exoplanets and a very specific argument about why Europa was more interesting than Mars, which she delivered to Emma with the confidence of someone presenting a thesis defense. "She's not wrong," Marcus said afterward when Emma relayed this in the kitchen. "I know," Emma said. "That's the thing about Sophie. She's usually not wrong." It was on a Wednesday, 10 days after her meeting at the Midtown office, that Nathan called her. She was in the break room between the lunch and dinner service, eating a bowl of whatever Marcus had made for staff lunch. Good that day, a chickpea stew that had been simmering since morning, when her phone lit up with his name. She answered. "I have the full picture," he said, without preamble. "It goes back 2 years. My financial team went through everything. Total discrepancy across all staff is approximately," a pause, $220,000 across 19 employees. Emma set down her spoon. 19, she said. 19, he confirmed. "You found 5. The payroll manipulation was more systematic than what was visible from the pattern you identified. Gerald has been running a secondary payment processing account that intercepts a percentage of each paycheck before direct deposit. It's sophisticated, not something you'd see without forensic accounting." She was quiet. "I'm calling you first," he said, "because you're the one who found it, and because I want you to know what happens next." He paused. "I'm having Gerald removed from the property today. Every affected employee will receive full restitution within the week. We've calculated the full 2-year amount plus interest, and I'm going public with what happened, with the full accounting, because the people who work in that restaurant deserve to know what was done and what I'm doing about it." Emma pressed her hand flat on the break room table, feeling the cool formica under her palm. "All 19 of them," she said. "All 19, starting with the people who've been there longest." A brief silence. "I owe them more than money. I know that. But the money is where I start." She breathed carefully. "Okay," she said. "There's one other thing," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, not less direct but more careful. "Gerald is going to fight this. He has a lawyer already. He's going to characterize this as a disgruntled employee with an agenda." A pause. "He's going to use your name, your history in Brooklyn. He's going to try to make the argument that you manufactured this." Emma closed her eyes for a moment. "I know," she said. "My legal team has the documentation. The forensic accounting stands entirely independent of anything you provided. Your records gave us the thread, but the evidence is in the payroll system itself. Gerald cannot explain the secondary account." His voice was even and certain. "He cannot touch you with this." "He can still try," she said. "He can try," Nathan agreed, "and I will make sure very publicly that he fails." She sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of being protected by something other than her own careful preparation, which was an unfamiliar feeling and one she didn't entirely know what to do with. "Emma," he said. "Yeah. I should have been paying closer attention to my own restaurant." The words were flat and matter-of-fact, which somehow made them more serious than if he'd been performatively contrite about it. 19 people, 2 years. That's on me." "You didn't know," she said. "I should have made it harder not to know," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't argue with that because it was true, and she respected him too much to pretend otherwise. "Thursday," she said, "I'll be at the restaurant." "I know," he said. "Marcus said he's making the consommé again." She almost laughed. The genuine, surprised kind. Of course he is. I'll be there at 7:45, he said. I know, she said. She hung up and sat in the break room for a while longer, finishing her chickpea stew, which had gone slightly cold but was still good. Through the kitchen door, she could hear the sounds of afternoon prep, the steady rhythm of a professional kitchen getting ready for another evening, the same sounds she'd been listening to in one form or another for 14 years. She thought about 19 people and $220,000. She thought about Paulina counting her paycheck in this same break room. She thought about Diane, who had worked at Meridian for 11 years and who Emma had not told what she was doing, not to exclude her, but to protect her, to keep her clear of the line of fire if things went sideways. She thought about Gerald Holt and his clipboard and his precise reading glasses, and the 9 years he'd spent building a reputation for reliability while quietly stealing from people who couldn't afford the theft. She thought about the particular kind of anger she felt, which was not hot and dramatic, but cold and long-burning, and had been with her since she was a young woman in Brooklyn who did the right thing and paid for it, and which she had learned to use as fuel rather than letting it become poison. When her break was over, she washed her bowl and put it in the rack and tied her apron and went out to set up her section for dinner. She passed the employee board on her way out. The scheduling sheet was there, with the hourly rates listed in Gerald's neat columns, the same document she'd studied in December. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she went to work. 2 days later, she arrived for her Thursday evening shift and found Gerald's office empty, the door standing open, the room cleared of his personal effects with the thoroughness of a departure that had been managed rather than chosen. There was a new name in the interim manager slot on the scheduling board, someone from the Callaway corporate office, a woman named Patterson, who had introduced herself to the staff that morning with the specific combination of warmth and efficiency that characterized people sent to stabilize a situation rather than run it. The kitchen was quieter than usual. People were processing. Emma could see it in the way Marcus moved around his station with slightly more deliberateness than normal, the way Paulina refilled the salt shakers with her head down and her jaw set. At 4 o'clock, Patterson called a brief all-staff meeting in the dining room. She stood at the front of the room, clear-eyed and direct, and explained what had happened, not in the soft language of corporate management that obscures more than it reveals, but plainly. The payroll irregularities, the forensic accounting, the secondary account, the 2-year period, the total amount. She said that every affected employee would receive a full statement of what had been taken from them and a check for the complete amount, including interest, within the next 5 business days. She said, Mr. Callaway wants you to know that this was a failure of oversight that he takes personal responsibility for, and that he is committed to ensuring it cannot happen again. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rolando, the prep cook who had been at Meridian for 4 years, said, The full amount, 2 years? Full amount, Patterson said. 2 years. Rolando nodded slowly, looking at the table. Diane was sitting 2 seats from Emma. She hadn't looked at Emma during the meeting, but now she did. A brief sideways look, the kind that says something without saying it, the kind that requires knowing someone well enough to read. Emma held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at Patterson. After the meeting broke up and people returned to their prep work with the subdued, processing energy of people who have just been handed a very large piece of information, Diane stopped beside Emma on her way to the floor. You, Diane said. One word, flat. I found something, Emma said. I documented it and took it to the right person. Diane looked at her for a long moment. A long, complicated moment, full of things Emma couldn't fully read. Then she said, 11 years I've worked here. I never noticed. You weren't looking for it, Emma said. You were doing your job. You'd think after 11 years I would have... Diane stopped, started again. My daughter's in college, she said, and it seemed like a non sequitur but wasn't. I've been picking up extra shifts to cover tuition. She paused. Some of those extra shifts were being... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I know, Emma said. Diane looked at her hands, then she nodded once, the particular nod that is not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implies that someone did you a favor, and this was more complicated than that. It was the nod of someone acknowledging that another person did a necessary thing. She went to set up her tables. Emma stood in the middle of the dining room for a moment, between the empty tables being dressed for Thursday's service, the white linen going down, the candles being set, the room preparing itself for another evening of performing warmth and elegance for people who came here to feel that the world was, at least in this particular corner of it, well arranged. Through the service window, she could see Marcus at his station, moving with the focused intensity that meant he was in the part of prep where he needed to think, not talk. She could see the stock pot on the back burner, the consommé, dark and slow, smelling of thyme and mushroom and the particular patience required to make something from scratch and let it tell you when it was ready. 7:45 was 4 hours away. She put on her apron and began to work. The dinner service that Thursday had a different quality to it than any other night she could remember working there. Not louder, not more dramatic, but present in a way that was harder to name. The staff moved with the specific attentiveness of people who have been reminded that things are not always what they appear, that the surface of something can be intact while something is wrong underneath, and who have therefore decided, at least for one evening, to pay close attention to the actual thing in front of them. Nathan Calloway arrived at 7:46. He looked tired, not the closed-off, armored tired of the man she had first met 4 months ago, but the open kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing something difficult and necessary, and not entirely painless. He handed his coat to the coat check and moved through the dining room with slightly less certainty than usual, as if the building itself had shifted under him and he was still finding his footing. He sat at table 14 and looked at the empty chair across from him. Emma came to his table. "Good evening," she said. He looked up at her. "How are they?" he said quietly. "The staff. How is everyone doing?" "Processing," she said honestly. "Marcus has the consommé." "Good," he said. Something in him seemed to settle slightly at this, the specific comfort of a small thing being exactly where it should be. She went to get it herself, ladling it into the white bowl, cutting the bread, buttering it the way she'd learned he liked. Not too heavy, the crust kept intact. She carried it out and set it before him without ceremony. He looked at it. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen in it before. Not the grief that was usually the primary weather of his face, but something alongside it, something that had been making more room lately. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did. I know what it cost." "I don't know yet what it cost," she said honestly. "We'll see." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll make sure it doesn't cost you what it cost you last time." She held his gaze. "Eat your soup," she said. It's getting cold." He almost smiled. "Yes, it is." She left him to it and went to her other tables, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do, one course at a time, one conversation at a time. The room slowly filling and then slowly emptying as the hours passed. She did not notice that Thursday evening the woman who had been sitting at the small table near the bar for the better part of 2 hours, nursing a glass of wine and watching, did not notice the way the woman's eyes had tracked from Emma to Nathan's table and back again, with the patient, systematic attention of someone conducting a very quiet, very private kind of investigation. She did not notice Victoria Calloway at all. She would later wish she had. Victoria Calloway was 41 years old and had spent the better part of those years being the person who noticed things before they became problems. It was not a role she had chosen exactly. It was a role that circumstances had built for her, one difficult year at a time. She had watched her brother build an empire from a studio apartment while she managed their mother's declining health and the family's legal affairs, and the 17 other things that needed managing while Nathan was being relentless and visionary, and whatever else the business press had decided to call him that quarter. She did not resent him for this. She had loved Nathan with the specific, slightly exasperated love of an older sister who understood that brilliance in one area rarely comes without corresponding deficits in others, and whose job it had become, by default and by genuine choice, to manage the deficits. When Claire died, Nathan's wife, Sophie's mother, the woman who had been the one other person capable of making Nathan eat and sleep and occasionally leave the office before midnight, Victoria had been the one who held things together in the immediate aftermath. She had arranged the funeral while Nathan sat in the living room, unable to make a decision about anything smaller than a business acquisition. She had organized Sophie's care in the first terrible weeks. She had handled the calls from the lawyers and the estate, and the small avalanche of practical things that death generates, because someone had to, and Nathan could not. And so she did. She had also, quietly, in the 3 years since, kept watch. Not intrusively, not in the way that would have made Nathan angry or Sophie uncomfortable, but with the background attentiveness of someone who understood that the people she loved were sometimes the last to see the things happening to them. She checked in with Nathan's assistant twice a month. She had lunch with Sophie's school counselor every semester. She paid attention to names and patterns and changes in behavior the way other people paid attention to weather. When Nathan's Thursday night ritual began to shift, when the reports from the restaurant stopped being about uneaten food and started being about something else, Victoria noticed. She had contacts at Meridian, not spies exactly, just people who knew her and who, in the natural course of conversation, mentioned things. One of those people mentioned the soup. Another mentioned the waitress. A third mentioned that Nathan had not only eaten his dinner, but had lingered at table 14 for an additional 45 minutes, engaged in what appeared to be actual conversation. Victoria began paying attention to Emma Carter in February. What she found initially was not alarming. Emma Carter, 30 years old, born in the Bronx, restaurant work since 16, some college, solid professional reputation, or what was left of it after the Brooklyn incident 2 years earlier. Victoria read the Brooklyn story twice and thought about it carefully. A manager stealing wages, an employee reporting it, the employee losing her job. On the surface, this read as a straightforward case of an honest person being punished for honesty. Victoria understood that this was one possible interpretation. She had also been a corporate attorney for 9 years before moving to the Calloway family office, and she knew that the surface of a story and its structure were not always the same thing. She began pulling the Brooklyn incident apart, not because she had found anything specifically wrong with Emma Carter. She hadn't. Not yet. But because her brother was worth $4.2 billion and was emotionally vulnerable in ways that his professional armor mostly concealed, and because Sophie was 7 years old and had already lost her mother, and because Victoria's job, the one she'd been doing since she was 24 years old and their mother got sick, was to see what was coming before it arrived. So she sat at the bar at Meridian on a Thursday evening in late February and watched Emma Carter work. What she saw was not what she expected. She had expected, she could admit this to herself, to see performance. The calculated warmth of someone managing an asset. The slight over-attentiveness that characterizes people who are aware of being watched and are adjusting their behavior accordingly. She had seen that often enough in enough contexts to recognize it on sight. What she saw instead was a woman who moved through the dining room with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who was genuinely good at their job and genuinely not thinking about who might be observing them. She saw Emma Carter spend 3 minutes talking to an elderly couple at table 11 about something that made the woman laugh, genuinely laugh, the kind that surprised her, and then pivot without transition to correcting a wine pour at table 8 and then arrive at table 14 with Nathan's dinner and say something brief and direct that made Nathan, very slightly, unclench. Victoria watched this and thought, she's real. Whatever else she is, the way she does this is real. She was also smart enough to know that real people could still have complicated motives. She flew back to Chicago. She split her time between both cities and spent 3 days on the phone with her contact who handled background research for the Calloway family office. She asked for everything on Emma Carter, which in her world meant everything: financial records, employment history, any litigation, any public records. What came back was almost entirely consistent with what she already knew. One anomaly. The anomaly was small. In the public filing associated with the Brooklyn labor dispute, there was a statement from the restaurant group's HR department characterizing Emma's complaint as having been filed following a performance review in which Ms. Carter received an unsatisfactory rating for interpersonal conduct. The implication, not stated directly but structured carefully, was that the complaint was reactive rather than genuine, that Emma had been facing discipline and had preemptively filed the wage theft claim to create leverage. The restaurant group's attorney had argued this in the subsequent wrongful termination proceeding. The proceeding had been dismissed, not on the merits, but on procedural grounds related to the arbitration clause in Emma's employment contract. Victoria read this 3 times. She sat with it. The HR characterization was a single document from an interested party. The restaurant group had every incentive to frame the complaint this way. The procedural dismissal meant no factual finding had ever been made about which version was true. She knew this. She also knew that Nathan was at a point in his recovery, his slow, difficult, non-linear recovery from 3 years of grief, where the wrong person at the wrong time could set him back in ways that would take years to repair. She knew that Sophie, who had apparently developed a specific and enthusiastic attachment to this woman, was 7 years old and would not understand the concept of calculated manipulation and would simply experience the loss of someone she'd allowed herself to care about. She was, she would later recognize, afraid. Not for Nathan's money or Sophie's inheritance or any of the practical things that attorneys think about. She was afraid in the particular way of someone who has spent years protecting a family from harm and knows that the most dangerous things are the ones that look like healing. She made a decision that she believed was right. She flew back to New York. She sat across from Nathan in his office on a Tuesday morning in early March and told him what she had found. She told it the way she'd been trained to present findings, organized, factual, specific. The Brooklyn proceeding, the HR characterization, the document, the procedural dismissal. She laid the papers on his desk the way Emma had laid her payroll documentation on the same desk 3 weeks earlier, and she watched her brother read them. She did not tell him what to think. She told him the facts as she understood them and let him draw his own conclusions, which was the version of this she'd rehearsed, the version she could live with. What she did not do, could not do because she had not done enough digging yet, was tell him that the HR characterization was from an interested party. She presented it as part of the factual record because it was part of the factual record, and she did not flag the way it was structured because she had not yet looked closely enough at who had written it and under what circumstances. This was the crack in the foundation, small, almost invisible, the kind that doesn't look like anything until the weight shifts and suddenly it's everything. Nathan read the documents. He was quiet for a long time. "You're saying she does this," he said finally. "She finds a situation, she builds trust, she creates leverage." "I'm saying there is documentation of a prior situation with a similar structure," Victoria said carefully. "I'm not telling you what it means. I'm telling you what I found." "She reported the payroll theft here to me directly," he said. "If she wanted leverage, she had it. She could have gone to the press, gone to the labor board, made this very public and very damaging. She didn't." "I know," Victoria said. "That's worth noting." "But," Victoria was quiet for a moment. "But she knew you, Nathan. She knew you'd respond. And she knew that helping you handle it internally put her in a particular position with you." She paused. "I'm not saying that's what it was. I'm saying it's a possible reading." Nathan looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at the window. He looked at Sophie's crayon drawing of Saturn that was still propped against the ledge. "You've met her?" Victoria said. "Twice outside the restaurant. Once to receive her documentation. Once brief encounter at a staff event." He paused. "She's not—" He stopped. "She's not what?" He shook his head slowly. "It doesn't matter what she seems like," he said. And Victoria recognized this as Nathan having already begun to convince himself of something. Seeming like isn't the same as being. She should have said something there. She would later understand that this was the moment, the hinge on which everything turned. She should have said, "Nathan, I'm giving you incomplete information. The document I found is from a party with an interest in the outcome. Before you act on this, we need more." She didn't say it. She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't say it, and more afraid of what would happen if Emma Carter was exactly what the document suggested and she'd said nothing. She let the moment pass. "I just need you to be careful," she said. "That's all." Nathan nodded slowly. He gathered the documents and squared them against the desk. He looked like someone who had just found a crack in something he'd thought was solid and didn't know yet how deep it ran and was doing the calculation about whether to ignore it. "Thank you," he said, "for looking into it." Victoria left. 3 days passed. Then it was Thursday. Emma arrived for her Thursday shift at 7:15 and set up her section and did the pre-service side work that was the same every week. Napkins, silverware, water glasses positioned at the 2 o'clock mark the way Gerald had required. and the way she'd continued doing it after Gerald left because it was her habit now, independent of him. She was carrying a tray of water glasses to table 12 when she became aware of Nathan standing near the host stand. This was unusual. He was 20 minutes early. He never arrived early. He was not heading to table 14. He was standing near the host stand, looking at the room in the particular way of someone who is waiting for something they've been steeling themselves for. When he saw her, he came across the room. Emma set the tray down on the nearest surface and turned to face him because his expression told her immediately that this was not a Thursday dinner arrival. "Can we talk?" he said. The restaurant was not yet open. There were 3 other staff members on the floor: Paulina folding napkins in the back, Diane setting up the bar section, a new runner named Derek polishing wine glasses. None of them were close enough to hear. "Of course," Emma said. He didn't pace. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets. He hadn't taken his coat off, she noticed, which meant he didn't intend to stay, and looked at her with the measuring gaze that she'd learned to read over the past 4 months. And what she read in it now was something she recognized from other contexts and had not expected to see here. He had already decided something. "My sister has been looking into your background," he said. He delivered this without softening, which she respected even as her stomach dropped. "She found documentation from the Brooklyn situation, an HR file from the restaurant group. It suggests the complaint you filed was made in response to a performance review, that there were concerns about your conduct before you reported the wage theft." The room was very still. Somewhere in the kitchen, Marcus called something out to Derek about the prep list, and the sound was completely incongruous. Normal, domestic, happening in the same world as this conversation. Emma said nothing for a moment. She was running through the Brooklyn situation in her head, systematically, the way she ran through things when she was trying to remember them accurately and not the way she wanted them to be. The performance review he was describing, she remembered it. She remembered it because it had been conducted by the same manager who had been stealing wages 3 days after she'd first accessed the payroll records, and it had cited interpersonal friction with management as its primary concern. She had understood at the time exactly what it was. The performance review, she said, keeping her voice level, was conducted by the manager who was stealing the wages. 3 days after I accessed the payroll records he knew I'd been looking at. Nathan looked at her. "That's your account," he said. The 2 words landed like a weight. "Yes," she said, "that's my account. It's also what I told the HR department when they contacted me, and what I put in writing in the subsequent proceeding." The proceeding was dismissed. "On procedural grounds," she said. "Arbitration clause. Not on the merits. There was no factual finding about who was telling the truth." "I know," he said. "Which means there's also no finding that supports your version." She looked at him. She could see it happening, could see the architecture of doubt being built in real time, one reasonable-sounding brick at a time, and she understood the structural logic of it even as it was being built around her. She understood because she knew what fear looked like in people who had been hurt and had healed badly and were now protecting the scar tissue at the expense of the living tissue underneath. She had a choice here. She could fight it, bring out her own documentation, walk him through the timeline, make the case methodically and specifically, and trust the evidence to speak clearly. She could see, in the set of his jaw and the position of his hands in his coat pockets, that this would not work. Not tonight. He had already done the thing that frightened people do, which is to construct a story that protects them and then look at the evidence through the story rather than the other way around. "Did I earn your trust," she said, "to gain something?" "I don't know," he said. It was a horrible thing to hear. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. Because it was the specific honesty of someone who is genuinely uncertain and saying so, which is almost more painful than a clean accusation. "You know what I found in your restaurant," she said. "You know why I brought it to you. You know what it cost me to do that given what happened in Brooklyn." Her voice was steady, and she intended to keep it that way. "If I was building leverage, I had it. I could have gone to the press. I didn't." "You didn't go to the press," he said. "You went to me, which put you in a particular position with me." She recognized this phrasing. She recognized it because it was not his phrasing. It was someone else's. Someone who had fed him an interpretation and watched it take hold. She felt something cold and specific settle in her chest. "Your sister's words," she said. He didn't confirm or deny it. "Nathan," she said, and saying his name was the first time she'd done that, and she heard the weight of it land between them. "I don't know what your sister found or how she framed it, but I know what happened in Brooklyn, and I know what happened here, and I know the difference between them is that here I brought the evidence to the person who could actually fix it, and the people who were being stolen from are going to get their money back." He was quiet. "That's what I did," she said. "That's all I did." The silence between them stretched out. In the kitchen, Marcus was starting the dinner service prep, the particular rhythm of a kitchen coming to life, heat and sound and the smell of stock coming up to temperature. "I believe that you believe that," Nathan said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Not a capitulation, not an agreement. The specific okay of someone who understands that continuing is not going to help anything, who has calculated the cost of fighting and found that the fight itself would cost more than she currently had. She had done this before. She had stood in a room and told the truth and watched someone look through it at the more comfortable story. It had the same weight it always had, which was considerable, but it was not a new weight. "I'll finish my shift tonight," she said, "and then I think it's better if I'm not here." Something moved across his face, something quick, almost suppressed. "Emma." "It's fine," she said, and she kept her voice even because she was not going to perform pain in front of him. "It's fine. I'll talk to Patterson about the schedule." She picked up her tray of water glasses and carried them to table 12 and set each one at the 2 o'clock position with the same care she always used, and she did not look back at the host stand to see whether he was still there. He was gone when she looked up 5 minutes later. She worked the shift. She worked it well, with the focused competence that had carried her through every bad situation she'd encountered in 14 years of restaurant work, because the only thing she knew how to do when the floor dropped out was to keep moving. She brought a birthday dessert to table 7 and sang with the rest of the floor staff, and the woman at the table cried happy tears, and Emma smiled genuinely because the moment was genuinely good, separate from everything else. She managed a difficult table of 8 who couldn't agree on anything and eventually ordered 3 separate entrees each and needed 4 additional sauce requests. She checked on Marcus twice during the rush and said nothing about the conversation at the host stand, and he said nothing about Nathan's absence from table 14, which they both noticed and neither acknowledged. At the end of service, she found Paulina in the break room. "I'm leaving," Emma said. "The job. I'm going to talk to Patterson tomorrow." Paulina stared at her. "What? Why?" Emma looked at her carefully. "It's complicated. Personal. It's not connected to the payroll situation. That's handled. That's done. You're protected." Emma. "You're going to be okay here," Emma said. "Patterson's good. The restitution is real, I know it is. Stay." Paulina was looking at her with the expression of someone putting together a picture from incomplete pieces and getting close enough to the truth to be troubled by it. "He found out something," Paulina said. "About you. Something that looks bad." Emma was quiet. "Something that isn't actually bad," Paulina said, which was not a question. "It's complicated," Emma said again. "Complicated enough that being here makes it worse." She went home on the 6 train with her bag in her lap, and her forehead against the cold window, and the tunnel light strobing past, and her mind doing the thing it did when she was trying not to feel something. Cataloging practical details, running logistics, planning the next move. She would call Patterson in the morning. She would be honest. She would say there was a conflict with the ownership that she couldn't resolve, that she was not the right fit going forward, that she wished the restaurant well. She had 3 weeks of savings. She had contacts now, good ones. The industry whisper network would be different this time because Gerald was the one whose reputation was burning, and hers was intact, at least publicly, at least for now. She got off at her stop and walked the 4 blocks to her building and climbed the stairs to her apartment and sat on her couch in her work clothes and did not cry, because she had made a rule about this a long time ago, which was that she was allowed to feel things but she was not allowed to stay in them, and staying required sitting still, so she didn't sit still. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened her notebook, Not the one with the payroll documentation, but the other one, the personal one she'd kept since she was 22, where she wrote down things she was trying to understand. She wrote down what had happened tonight in the spare, factual way she wrote things down when she needed to see them outside of her head. She wrote, "He already believed it when he came in. Someone had organized the information in a particular order, and he was already looking through that order at everything else." She wrote, "The version of events that protects frightened people is always more comfortable than the version that requires trusting someone new." She wrote, "I was right about him. I was right that he was the kind of person who could handle the truth, and I was right about how much that would matter once someone got to him first with a better story." She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote, "Paulina gets her money back. Diane gets her money back. All 19 of them. That part worked. Whatever else happened, that part worked." She underlined it. She closed the notebook and finished her tea and went to bed, and the city made its nighttime sounds outside her window. The particular texture of a Manhattan night, traffic and distant voices, and the periodic mechanical exhale of a bus. And she lay in the dark and thought about a man who had ordered food he didn't eat for 3 years and one night finally finished a bowl of soup, and about the specific sadness of watching someone choose the familiar darkness over the unfamiliar light, not because the darkness was better, but because it was known. She thought about Sophie, and this was the part that was hardest. Sophie, who had brought her the specific weight of a 7-year-old's trust, which is heavier than it looks. Sophie, who had told her that Saturn was worth looking at. Sophie, who had said thank you for making my dad eat with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that gratitude makes you vulnerable. Emma was aware, lying in her dark apartment, that she was going to have to learn how to not think about Sophie. She was going to have to practice that, the way you practice something uncomfortable until it becomes tolerable. She told herself it would get easier. She mostly believed it. What she did not know, could not know, lying in her apartment on the night of a Thursday in early March, was that Victoria Calloway was not sleeping either. That Victoria had driven home from her Midtown hotel through the quiet of a late New York evening and had sat in her rental car in the parking garage for 12 minutes doing the thing she rarely let herself do, which was to doubt the decision she'd already made. She was thinking about the phrasing in the HR document. She was thinking about the way it was structured, not quite lying, but organized. Organized the way a case is organized when someone is building a defense. She was also thinking about Emma Carter's face, which she had watched for 2 hours at Meridian and which had not performed anything, which had moved through the room with the specific unrehearsed quality of someone who was doing a job they were good at for its own sake, not for an audience. She was a good attorney, even now, even years removed from practice. And good attorneys are trained to notice when evidence is organized and when it is simply true, and those two things are not always the same. She was sitting in the parking garage thinking about this when her phone rang. It was her contact at the family research firm. "I went back to the Brooklyn case," the contact said. "The HR document, the performance review." Victoria sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "The performance review was conducted by the general manager, the one who was later internally censured for the wage theft." "I know that." "What I didn't flag the first time, the date on the performance review is 3 days after an internal IT log shows someone accessed the payroll processing system from Emma Carter's workstation." The parking garage was very quiet. "She was already looking at the records," Victoria said, before the complaint." "Correct. Which means the review came after she'd already found something, not before." "He knew she was looking." "That's the inference," the contact said carefully. "I can't confirm what he knew, but the timeline is not what the document implies," Victoria said. A pause. "No, it's not." She sat in the car for a long time after she hung up. She had given Nathan the document. She had framed it as factual. She had watched her brother, who was afraid and healing and imperfect in every human way, take that document and build a fortress out of it, and she had let him because she had been afraid too. She called Nathan. He didn't answer. It was late. She called again, and he silenced it. She sent a text. "I need to talk to you about Emma Carter. Call me tonight when you can. It's important." He did not call back that night. Victoria sat in the parking garage and understood, with the clarity that comes too late and costs too much, what she had done. She had given her brother a weapon and called it protection. She had organized incomplete information into a story that felt like certainty and watched a frightened man use it to push away the first person in 3 years who had reached him. She had been trying to protect Nathan and Sophie. She had instead, with the best of intentions and the most careful of methods, done something she was going to have to spend a significant amount of time and effort undoing. She drove back to her hotel. She did not sleep. Emma Carter, across the city, finally did. The specific exhausted sleep of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally, not by choice but by necessity, set it down. The notebook was still open on the kitchen table. The last line she'd written, underlined twice, was visible in the streetlight coming through the window. That part worked. The city moved around both women, and between them, in the dark, Nathan Calloway sat in the house that used to be a home and held a document his sister had given him and tried to decide what he believed. He was not good at this. He had never been good at the quiet, necessary work of deciding what was true when the truth was uncomfortable. He was excellent at problems with clear data and clear solutions. He was less excellent at the human problems, the ones where the data was feelings and the solution required him to be braver than his fear. He sat with the document for a long time. Then he put it in his desk drawer and went to check on Sophie, who was asleep in her room with a library book about neutron stars open on her pillow and her telescope positioned to catch whatever the New York sky was willing to show her through the window. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter. She had her mother's certainty. She also had, he was beginning to understand, a better instinct for people than he did. He turned off her light, carefully so the telescope wouldn't be disturbed, and went back to his own room and lay in the dark for a long time. And the document sat in its drawer, and the city continued outside, and nothing was resolved, and the weight of it was considerable. He fell asleep eventually, the way you fall asleep when exhaustion overrules everything else. In the morning, he would have to decide what was true. He was not looking forward to the morning. He did not call Victoria back that night. He didn't call her in the morning either, because the morning was Sophie's school drop-off, and a 9 o'clock call with his infrastructure team about the Chicago expansion, and 2 back-to-back meetings that ran until noon, and by the time he surfaced from all of it, the day had the quality of something that had happened to him, rather than something he'd lived through deliberately. Victoria's text was still on his phone. "Call me tonight when you can. It's important." He told himself he would call her after the afternoon meeting. Then the afternoon meeting ran long, and his assistant flagged 3 urgent items, and by 7 o'clock he was in the back of a car heading to Sophie's school pickup. She had an evening science club on Fridays, the one she'd joined in January with the specific intensity of someone who has identified their people. And the day was gone. He was operating on the particular autopilot of a person who has placed a difficult feeling in a drawer and closed it, and is now moving through their hours with great efficiency and no interiority. He was good at this. He had been good at it for 3 years. Sophie got in the car with her backpack and her coat half unzipped, and the expression she wore when something at science club had either thrilled or frustrated her, and he couldn't tell which until she said, "We did spectroscopy today," with the tone of someone reporting a religious experience, which answered the question. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The full account took 11 minutes and covered the basic science of light refraction, the specific setup of the equipment the club used, the fact that her friend Anya had knocked the prism off the table but it hadn't broken, and a detailed comparison between what they'd observed and what Sophie had read in her neutron star book. He listened with the part of himself that was always genuinely interested in Sophie's scientific education, and nodded and asked 2 questions that he knew from experience were the kind she found satisfying: specific, technical, taking her seriously. She was good. She was really good, at 7, in a way that went beyond pride into something more complicated. The specific complicated feeling of watching your child be more certain about the world than you are. When they got home and Sophie went upstairs to feed her fish, 3 of them, named after astronomers, which she had explained to him at length in November, he sat at the kitchen table and finally opened his phone. 7:15. Victoria would be on Eastern Time in her hotel. He called. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "I went back to the Brooklyn case," she said, without preamble, because this was how they talked to each other, without the social scaffolding that other people used. "My contact pulled the full record. The performance review in the HR document. Nathan, it was conducted 3 days after the payroll system logs show Emma accessed the records. He was quiet. She was already looking, Victoria said, before the review, before the complaint. The manager conducted the review after she'd already found something, not before. The document I gave you implies the review predates the complaint. The timeline is the opposite. He sat at his kitchen table and looked at the middle distance. The review was retaliation, he said. That's what the timeline suggests, yes. And the HR department's characterization was written by people employed by the man who was stealing from his staff, Victoria said, and her voice had something in it he rarely heard from her, a specific tightness that wasn't quite guilt but was adjacent to it. I gave you an interested party's document and presented it as part of the factual record without flagging the interest. A pause. I missed it the first time. I should not have missed it. The kitchen was very quiet. Upstairs he could hear Sophie moving around her room, the soft thump of her putting her backpack down. I went to the restaurant last Thursday, Nathan said. I know. I said things to her. Victoria was quiet. She didn't argue, he said. She just... He stopped. He ran the conversation back in his head, the way he'd been running it since he got in the car that night and had been mostly successful at not running it since. She told me the true account, and I told her it was just her account, and she said okay and went back to work. Nathan, she left the job, he said. She called Patterson the next morning. I got the notice from HR. Another silence, longer this time. I know, Victoria said quietly. I saw it. He stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. Outside, the street was doing its Friday evening thing, people moving home from work, the particular loosening quality of a city exhaling into a weekend. A woman walked past with a dog, a kid on a bike. The ordinary world moving. I trusted you, he said. Not an accusation, just a statement of how it had worked. I know. Victoria's voice was flat, in the way voices go flat when the person speaking has already taken themselves apart over something, and is now just reporting the results. I was trying to protect you, and Sophie, and I moved too fast on incomplete information, and She stopped. I was afraid, Nathan, of you getting hurt again, of Sophie getting hurt, and I let that fear organize the facts into a shape that fit what I was afraid of instead of what was actually there. He thought about this. He thought about a bowl of consommé and a woman who had told him the true thing when no one else would and asked for nothing in return, and then, when the moment required it, done it again. Had brought him documentation of theft in his own restaurant at significant personal risk and asked for nothing in return. He thought about what he'd said to her. I believe that you believe that. He thought about the expression on her face when he said it. Not wounded, exactly. The expression of someone who has encountered this particular shape of injustice before and has developed, out of necessity, a very practiced way of not showing how much it costs. I have to fix this, he said. Yes, Victoria agreed. You do. Tell me the full picture. Everything your contact found, all of it. She told him. It took 30 minutes, and by the end of it, he had the complete version of the Brooklyn story. The timeline that showed Emma's access of the payroll records before the performance review, the manager's internal censure and transfer, the arbitration clause that had killed the proceeding before any factual finding was made, the reference letter carefully designed to say nothing. The full account of what had been done to Emma Carter 2.5 years ago by people who were protecting a thief. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I did the same thing, he said. I protected myself at the cost of someone who told me the truth. Victoria didn't respond to that immediately. You're not the same as them, she said finally. I did the same thing, he said again. Not self-pity, just the specific honesty of someone who has decided to look at a thing clearly and is doing so without flinching. The mechanism was different. The result was the same. She lost her job because someone with more power than her decided the comfortable story was more useful than the true one. Nathan, where is she working? He said. A pause. I don't know. She left Meridian 2 weeks ago. My contact is still... Find out, he said. Please. I will, Victoria said. Nathan, I'm sorry. I know you were trying to protect us, he said. And he did know it, which was the complicated part. He knew his sister, and he knew how she moved through the world, and he knew that her fear was real, and that it had come from love, and that none of that made the outcome any less wrong. I know why you did it. It's still something we both have to fix. Both, she said. Both, he said. You're going to have to talk to her too. Another silence. Yes, Victoria said. I know. He hung up and stood at the window for a while longer, watching the ordinary Friday street, and then he went upstairs and knocked on Sophie's door. Come in. She was at her desk with the Neutron Star book and a notebook where she'd been drawing diagrams, event horizons, from the look of it, drawn with the careful layered lines of someone who has spent time thinking about the shape of things. He sat on the edge of her bed. You haven't mentioned Emma in a while, Sophie said, without looking up from her diagram. She said it with the specific studied casualness of a 7-year-old who has decided that the direct approach might not work and is trying a different angle. He looked at his daughter. I know, he said. Is she okay? He thought about how to answer this honestly without getting into the parts that Sophie didn't need to carry. I made a mistake, he said. I believed something that wasn't true, and it hurt her, and I'm going to try to fix it. Sophie looked up from her notebook. She looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze that she had inherited, Victoria had always said, from their mother. A gaze that was not soft, but was not hard either, that was simply honest. What kind of mistake? Sophie said. The kind where you're scared, he said, and you let the scared part make a decision that the rest of you wouldn't have made. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most problems. You should tell her, she said. Emma, you should tell her what you just told me. I'm going to try. Not try, Sophie said, with the particular firmness of someone who has absorbed the distinction between trying and doing. Tell her. Actually, tell her. He looked at his daughter for a moment, at this 7-year-old person who had her mother's certainty and his stubbornness and her own particular version of wisdom that was not like either of theirs. Okay, he said, I will. Sophie nodded and went back to her event horizon diagram. He sat there for another minute just in the room with her, in the quiet that had a different quality than the quiet of table 14. This one was not haunted by absence, but filled by the ordinary presence of a child doing her work. It was the kind of quiet he had not been able to access for 3 years, and had only recently begun to find his way back to. And Emma Carter was part of why, and he had repaid her for that with the one thing she'd experienced enough to recognize on sight. He went to his office and called his assistant. I need to find someone, he said. Emma Carter, former Meridian employee. I need to know where she is. I'll start looking, his assistant said. Any urgency? He thought about the 2 weeks she'd been gone. He thought about what she was likely doing. Rebuilding, again, in the careful, methodical way she'd described rebuilding after Brooklyn, picking up shifts, navigating the industry network that had let her down once and might be more cooperative this time. He thought about the weight she'd been carrying when she walked out of his restaurant on a Thursday night in March, with her tray and her water glasses and her practiced, unperformed steadiness. Yes, he said. Urgency. It took his assistant 4 days to locate Emma Carter, which was longer than he expected and which told him something about how carefully she moved through the world, not hiding exactly, but not making herself easy to find either. She had apparently told several former colleagues that she was taking a short break before looking for her next position and had otherwise not announced herself. She was working at a place called Bet's, a diner on the Upper West Side that had been open for 40 years and specialized in breakfast all day, and the kind of uncomplicated competence that kept neighborhood restaurants alive across decades of changing city trends. She was working the early shift, 6 to 2, which meant she was up before 5 and on the subway while most of the city was still in the dark. Nathan's assistant had found this out through a former Meridian staff member who had heard it secondhand from someone in the industry. He went on a Tuesday. He arrived at Bet's at 10:15, which he calculated was past the breakfast rush and before the lunch crowd, and walked in through a glass door with a handwritten specials board that listed things like Denver omelet, real ham, Ask for Marco, and the lemon pancakes are back. The place was maybe 60% full, the particular comfortable density of a neighborhood diner that people had made a habit of. It smelled like coffee and butter and griddle smoke and something that might have been apple pie. He stood inside the entrance and scanned the room. Emma was at the far end of the counter, handing 2 plates to a man in a gray jacket who was reading a newspaper. She was wearing a Bet's apron, blue, slightly faded, over a black shirt, her hair pulled back the same way she wore it at Meridian. She was talking to the man briefly, something short and probably about the food, and he nodded and she moved on, and she had not seen Nathan yet. He took a stool at the counter, near the end away from the door. He waited. She came around the counter, passed through about 90 seconds later, coffee carafe in hand, and stopped. She went very still for a moment. Her face did the thing he had seen it do at Meridian, the rapid internal calibration. Not fear, not quite, but the adjacent thing. Then she came toward him. She stopped on the other side of the counter, coffee carafe in hand, and looked at him with an expression that gave him very little to read. "Coffee?" she said. He almost laughed at the evenness of this. "Please," he said. She poured it. She set the carafe down and put both hands on the edge of the counter and looked at him. "You found me," she said. "It took 4 days," he said. "You're not easy to find." "I wasn't trying to be found." "I know." He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her. "Emma, I need Nathan." She said his name the way she'd said it that last night at Meridian. Weighted, real. "I'm at work." "I know, I'll be quick." He paused. "I won't be quick, actually, but I'll wait until your break, if that's better." She studied him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Boz. Assessment. Calculation. The specific evaluation of a person deciding how much of their time and attention a thing is worth. 12:30, she said. "I get 30 minutes." "I'll be here," he said. She went back to work. He sat at the counter and drank his coffee and did not pretend to look at the menu, and she did not come back to his end of the counter, and the diner moved around them both with the comfortable indifference of a place that had seen enough people sit at its counter with difficult things happening behind their eyes that it no longer found it remarkable. At 12:30, she came out from behind the counter with her apron off and sat on the stool next to him. "You have 30 minutes, she said. He had rehearsed this. He had spent 4 days since Victoria's call finding the right words, which he understood were not about being eloquent, but about being accurate. He had learned this from Emma herself, the specific value of saying the true thing, even when the true thing was unflattering. "My sister gave me a document from the Brooklyn HR file," he said. "She framed it as factual. It suggested the complaint you filed was reactive, that you were facing discipline before you reported the theft." He paused. "I believed it. I used it to confirm the fear I was already carrying, which is what frightened people do with evidence that fits their fear. And I said things to you that were not fair and not accurate, and that cost you your job." Emma was looking at the counter. She turned her coffee cup. She'd poured herself one when she sat down, slowly with 2 fingers. "My sister went back to the record," he continued. "The performance review was 3 days after the payroll system logs show you accessed the records. The manager knew you'd been looking. The review was retaliation, not cause. The document she gave me was written by people protecting the man who was stealing from his staff. And she didn't flag that when she gave it to me, and I didn't ask." Emma turned her coffee cup again. "Once. I know what happened in Brooklyn," he said. "The complete version. I know what they did to you and what it cost you and how you rebuilt from it. And then you came to Meridian and you did the same thing again. Found something wrong and documented it carefully and brought it to the person who could fix it. And I fixed it because of you. And 19 people got their money back because of you. And then I stood in my own restaurant and looked at you through someone else's interpretation and said, I believe that you believe that. And you walked away without arguing because you understood, before I did, that arguing wasn't going to work." The diner moved around them. A couple near the window asked for the check. The cook called something back to a server. A kid at the booth by the door was doing homework. "What do you want me to say?" Emma said. Her voice was even and real. Not cold, never quite cold, but clear. "Nothing," he said. "I don't need you to say anything. I came here to say the true thing because you deserve to hear it said directly." He paused. I was wrong. I let fear make a decision that cost someone who didn't deserve to pay for my fear. I'm sorry." She turned her coffee cup once more. She looked at it. She looked at the counter. She looked briefly at the window. "Your sister was protecting you," she said. "My sister made a mistake," he said. "She knows it. She was trying to protect Sophie." "Emma," he said it quietly, "you don't have to defend her. Not to me. Not right now." She was quiet. "The job at Meridian," he said. "I want to offer it back. Patterson has kept your section open. I asked her to when I understood what had happened. Your staff, your schedule, your section, everything as it was." She looked at him then, a real look, not guarded, but searching. "Why?" she said. "Because it was your job and you did nothing to lose it, and the situation that took it from you was based on false information." He paused. "That's the practical answer." "What's the other answer?" He looked at her. He had practiced this part too, and had decided in the end that the practiced version was less true than the unpracticed one. "Because Marcus has been making the consommé every Thursday for the past 2 weeks, and putting it in the walk-in when it goes unclaimed," he said. "And Sophie asked me 3 days ago if you had found a telescope yet. And because I'm better at recognizing when something is real than I was 2 weeks ago, and I don't want to be the kind of man who lets fear make the important decisions." He paused. "And because you told me the true thing when no one else would, twice, and I want to be someone you can keep doing that with." The 30 minutes were almost up. Emma had her hands flat on the counter now, both of them, and was looking at the door to the kitchen where she'd need to be in about 2 minutes. "The job," she said slowly. "Yes." "The same job." "Yes." "And I'm supposed to just come back to the restaurant where you accused me of manipulating you." "Yes," he said. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like something I've done before," she said. "The rebuilding in the same place thing. It doesn't always go the way you think." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust that it will. I'm asking you to come back and see." She was quiet for a long moment. "I need to think about it," she said. "Okay. That's not a no." "I heard it as a not yet," he said. "I can work with not yet." She looked at him, a brief, complicated look. And then she stood up and picked up her apron. "Leave your number with Marco at the counter," she said. "I'll call you." She went back to work. He left his number with Marco, who was a large man with a handlebar mustache who took the piece of paper without comment and tucked it next to the register with the specific professional neutrality of someone who had seen a lot of things happen at his counter and had opinions about none of them. Nathan walked out into the late morning of a Tuesday in March, with the particular feeling of a person who has said the necessary thing and now must simply wait, which he had never been good at but was possibly going to have to get better at. He did not hear from Emma that day. He did not hear from her the next day either. On Thursday, he went to Meridian and sat at table 14 and ordered the dinner that he'd been unable to finish for 3 years. And Patricia, a server covering Emma's section, competent and kind and not Emma, brought it out, and he looked at it and ate about half of it, which was better than sending it back, and left a $400 tip and went home. He told himself this was fine. He told himself he had done what he could do and the rest was up to Emma, and that this was how it worked when you had burned something down with your own hands. You could rebuild the structure, but you couldn't make someone walk back into it. Victoria flew back to New York on Friday. She arrived at his house at 7 in the evening with takeout from a Thai place she'd remembered he liked, and a bottle of wine she'd chosen with the specific care of someone who is trying to have a conversation they'd rather not have. She sat across from him at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat 2 nights ago running the clock on not hearing from Emma, and put her hands flat on the table in a way that reminded him, for a moment, of Emma in the diner. "I want to apologize properly," Victoria said. "Not for the reason I did it, for the way I did it." "You don't have to—" "I do," she said. "Let me." She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "I've spent 17 years being the person who sees things coming, since Mom got sick. Since you started building things and I was the one watching the perimeter, and I'm good at it most of the time, and it's kept a lot of bad things from happening." She paused. And somewhere in the middle of being good at it, I started believing that my version of what was dangerous was automatically more reliable than other people's version of what was safe. And that's not the same thing. He looked at her. She's not dangerous, Victoria said. I knew that when I sat in Meridian and watched her work. I knew it before I had all the information. And I gave you the document anyway because I was afraid of the alternative, which was telling you that I thought she was real and watching you move towards something that might hurt you and not being able to stop it. Nathan was quiet for a moment. You could have just told me that, he said, that you were afraid. I know, she said. I know I could have. She picked up her wine glass and put it down without drinking. I'm sorry, Nathan, for what it did to her, and for what it did to you. He looked at his sister, at the specific, tired, honest face of someone who has been doing a job with love and with error for 17 years and knows the difference. I found her, he said. I went and talked to her. Victoria looked up. I told her the full version, he said. The timeline, what the document actually was, what I should have done. He paused. I asked her to come back. What did she say? Not yet. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to talk to her. I know, he said. I told her that. In the conversation that went better in my head than in reality. Victoria almost smiled. Almost. She'll come back, Victoria said. It was not optimism. Not from Victoria, who was structurally opposed to unfounded optimism. It was assessment. She's not the kind of person who runs. I know, he said. I know she's not. They ate the Thai food and talked about other things. Sophie's Science Club, the Chicago expansion, a property issue that needed Victoria's legal attention. And the conversation moved the way it always moved between them, without much ceremony, because they had been talking to each other for 32 years and had long since stopped needing the ceremony. After Victoria left, he sat at the kitchen table for a while, the takeout containers cleared, his wine half finished. He was looking at the kitchen the way you look at a space you've spent a lot of time in and are suddenly seeing differently. The particular slant of the light, the familiar objects in their familiar places, the specific quality of quiet. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Emma Carter. He opened the message. I'll come back. But I need it to be different, not the same job in the same arrangement. I need to know that what I found matters in an ongoing way, not as a one-time fix. If the restaurant is going to be better, I want to be part of making it better. He read it twice. He typed back, I wouldn't want it any other way. When? 3 minutes passed. He sat with his phone on the table and did not pick it up and waited, which he was slightly better at now than he'd been 2 weeks ago. Her reply came, Monday, 6 p.m. I want to talk about what better actually means before I put my apron back on. He typed, Monday, 6 p.m. I'll be there. He set the phone down. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a long time, not doing anything, which was unusual for him and which felt different than the paralyzed stillness of the past 3 years. This stillness was not grief-shaped. It was the stillness of someone who has been moving very fast for a very long time and has briefly, for one evening, stopped. He thought about Emma sitting at the Betts counter turning her coffee cup with 2 fingers. He thought about what it had cost her to send that text, the specific calculation of someone who had been wronged and was choosing to come back anyway, not because the wrong had been made right, but because the person who had wronged her had shown up and said the true thing. He understood, sitting in his kitchen on a Friday night in March, that this was what she'd been doing for him since November, showing up and saying the true thing, not because she wanted anything from it, because she was built that way. He understood also that being built that way was not a virtue that had made her life easier. It had made it significantly harder, and that she'd kept doing it anyway. Upstairs, Sophie was asleep with her astronomy books and her telescope aimed at the New York sky. He got up and went to his office and opened his laptop and began drafting notes for Monday's conversation, because he was not a man who went into important conversations unprepared. And because what Emma had asked for, I want to know that what I found matters in an ongoing way, was a reasonable ask and deserved a real answer. He worked until midnight and then he went to bed, and for the first time in a while he went to sleep without the specific weight of something unresolved pressing on his chest. There was still plenty unresolved. He was under no illusion about that. But there was a Monday now, and a conversation scheduled for Monday, and that was enough for tonight. He slept. In the morning, Sophie came downstairs for breakfast and found him already in the kitchen, which was unusual. He was normally still in his office at this hour. She looked at him with the assessing gaze. "You slept," she said. "I did." She sat down at the table. "Did you talk to Emma?" "She's coming Monday," he said. Sophie nodded with the satisfied certainty of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "I told you," she said. "Tell her. Actually tell her." She accepted the bowl of cereal he put in front of her. "Can I come Monday?" "It's a school night." "So it'll be fast." He looked at his daughter. "Maybe not Monday," he said, "but soon." Sophie considered this. "Is soon before or after you fix it completely?" He thought about this honestly, because Sophie always knew when he wasn't being honest. "I don't know yet," he said. "That part might take a while." She nodded, apparently satisfied that he was at least being accurate about his uncertainty, which she had always preferred over false confidence. "Okay," she said, "but tell me when." "You'll be the first to know," he said. She ate her cereal and he drank his coffee, and the morning moved the way mornings do when things are not perfect but are moving in the right direction, which is the only kind of morning that is actually sustainable. Outside the kitchen window, the March sky was doing something that might eventually become spring. Not there yet, still gray and cold, but with a quality to the light that suggested the season was considering changing its mind about winter. He watched it for a moment. Then he went back to his notes for Monday. Monday came in cold and clear, the kind of March evening that hadn't decided yet whether it was still winter or something else, the sky going dark blue at the edges by 6 o'clock with a sharpness that made the city look temporary, like a photograph. Emma arrived at Meridian at 5:58. She stood outside the entrance for a moment before going in, not hesitating exactly, but taking the kind of breath that precedes something you've decided to do but haven't quite done yet. The restaurant wasn't open for dinner service until 7, which meant the room was quiet, half-lit, the ambient warmth of the kitchen running but the dining floor not yet dressed. It looked different in this in-between state, less performed, more like what it actually was, which was a room with tables and chairs and 40 years of other people's evenings stored somewhere in its walls. Patterson met her at the door and led her to the private dining room off the main floor, a smaller room they used for events, which had been set up with a table and 4 chairs and water and a coffee carafe that was visibly fresh. Not a corporate setup, no presentation materials, no projector, nothing that looked like a negotiation, just a table and chairs and the carafe, which Emma read as intentional. Nathan was already there. He was standing near the window when she came in, not behind the table in the way that would have been a power position, and he turned when she entered and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was something like braced, the expression of a person who has prepared as well as they can and is now simply present and waiting for the actual thing. "Emma," he said. "Nathan," she said. They sat down across from each other. Not adversarially. The table was small enough that across didn't feel far. Patterson poured coffee and left, and then it was just the two of them and the quiet room, and the work of figuring out whether the distance between where they'd left things and where they needed to be was bridgeable. Emma put both hands flat on the table, was it? She'd noticed herself doing this more often lately, this grounding gesture, pressing her palms to surfaces as if checking that things were solid, and looked at him directly. "I want to say something before you go through whatever you've prepared," she said. He nodded. "I'm coming back because the situation here is better than it was," she said. "The people who were being stolen from got their money. Gerald is gone. Those are real things that happened because I said something and you acted on it." She paused. "I'm not coming back because everything is fixed between us. It's not. You believed the wrong thing about me and it cost me, and an apology doesn't undo the cost, it just acknowledges it. I need you to know I understand the difference." "I do know the difference," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." "Okay," she said. "Good." He reached into the folder he'd brought and pulled out a single piece of paper and slid it across the table. She looked at it. It was not a job offer document exactly. It was a page of notes, handwritten, his handwriting smaller and more deliberate than she'd have guessed. "You said you wanted it to be different," he said. "Not the same job in the same arrangement, I want to tell you what I think that means practically, and I want you to tell me what I'm missing." She read the notes. She took her time with them. What he'd written was specific, not vague. A new position, not floor staff, but something between floor and management. A wage transparency coordinator was what he'd written, which was a title she'd never seen before, and which he'd clearly made up, and which she was quietly certain was made up specifically for her. The scope included monitoring payroll across the Callaway restaurant properties. There were 4 others besides Meridian, on a quarterly basis, with direct reporting access to the family office rather than to any property manager. It included a salary that was more than she'd made at her best previous job. It included a clause she read twice. Independent reporting authority. Staff concerns brought to this position cannot be redirected or suppressed by any property management. She set the paper down. "You made this up," she said. "The title, yes," he said. "The need for it is not made up. I have 4 other restaurants, and I don't have anyone whose specific job is to pay attention to whether the people working in them are being paid correctly." He paused. "I should have had that before Gerald. I didn't. That's a structural problem I want to fix." "You want to fix it with me?" "I want to fix it with someone who has demonstrated twice that they know how to find these problems and what to do with them," he said. "You're the only person I know who qualifies." Emma looked at the paper again. The Independent Reporting Authority Clause. The direct access to the family office. The specific, unambiguous scope. "If I find something in one of your other properties," she said, "you bring it to me directly, same as before. And if what I find implicates someone you trust." He looked at her steadily. "Same as before," he said. She absorbed this. "I'd want to keep a section at Meridian," she said. "Floor shifts. I don't want to be entirely off the floor." He blinked, slightly surprised. "Okay." "I'm better at the oversight work if I'm still doing the floor work," she said. "I notice things differently when I'm in the room as a server than when I'm in the room as someone official. People talk to me differently." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing this, the specific pragmatic logic of it, which was the kind of thing he understood. "That's actually smart," he said. "I've been doing this a long time," she said. "I know you have." She looked at the paper one more time, and then she set it down and looked at him. "I have one more condition," she said. "Tell me." "Your sister," she said. "I want to talk to her, not for her to apologize to me necessarily. I need to have a conversation with her directly, without you in the middle of it." Nathan was quiet. "I'll arrange it," he said, "if she's willing." "Ask her," Emma said. "I think she'll say yes." He nodded. She picked up the piece of paper and folded it once and put it in her bag. "Monday next week," she said. "I'll be here Monday." Something in Nathan Callaway's face did the thing she'd been watching it do since November. That brief, fractional opening, the small weather change behind the eyes. She'd cataloged it over many Thursdays and had come to understand it as the specific expression of a man who was surprised, each time, to find that something good was still capable of happening to him. "Monday," he said. "And Thursday," she said, standing up. "I'll cover table 14 on Thursdays." He stood as well. They were both standing now, on either side of the small table, and it was not a dramatic moment. It was just 2 people in a quiet room who had managed to say enough true things to make the next part possible. "Emma," he said. She waited. "I know it doesn't undo anything," he said. "What I did. But I need you to know that I understand what I asked you to pay for my fear. I know what it cost, and I'm going to spend whatever time I'm given making sure it was the last time something like that happens in anything I'm responsible for." She looked at him for a moment. The thing about Nathan Callaway, she had understood since November, was that he was not actually good with words the way some people were. He was good with systems and structures and the clean logic of numbers. And words cost him something, and that meant when he used them carefully, it was because he meant them. "That's enough," she said. "For now, that's enough." She left. Marcus was in the kitchen when she went through the service corridor on her way out. He was at his station doing what he always did at this hour, the precise, absorbed work of a man who found the pre-service kitchen the most honest place in the world. He looked up when she came through. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. He turned back to his station, and she kept walking, and that was enough between them. The particular economy of people who have worked alongside each other and understand that some things don't require language. She walked out onto the street and the cold hit her face, and she stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside Meridian with the ordinary city moving around her, and she thought about what she'd agreed to and whether it was right. She thought about the fact that she was not walking back into the same situation. She was walking back into a changed situation, with different terms and different structure and the specific safeguards that came from having learned, twice, how things go wrong when the structure doesn't support the truth. She thought about the fact that this did not make her feel safe exactly. Nothing made her feel safe exactly, and she had stopped waiting for that feeling around the time she was 23 and understood it wasn't coming. What she felt instead was clear, and clear was something she could work with. She walked to the subway. Victoria called her on Wednesday. They met at a coffee shop in the West Village, neutral ground, which Emma had suggested and Victoria had agreed to without comment. Victoria arrived 3 minutes early, which Emma registered as the behavior of someone who wanted to demonstrate that they were taking the meeting seriously. And Emma arrived on time, and they sat across from each other with their coffees and regarded each other the way two people regard each other when they have significant history and none of it has been direct. Victoria Calloway in person was not quite what Emma had expected, though she was not sure exactly what she'd expected. She was 41, polished in the specific way of someone who had operated in legal and financial environments for 20 years and had learned to present herself as a version of competent that left no surface for doubt to grip. She was also, Emma saw immediately, not entirely comfortable, which was either genuine or a very good performance of genuine, and Emma had become good enough at reading people to believe it was the former. "I want to tell you what I did," Victoria said, without framing it as a justification. "Okay," Emma said. Victoria told it. All of it. The watching, the research, the Brooklyn document, the decision to present it to Nathan without flagging the conflict of interest in the source, the call from her research contact 3 days later that had undone everything she'd built. She told it with the specific precision of an attorney giving an account of her own conduct, which meant she didn't soften it or expand it. She just said what happened in the order it happened. When she finished, she put her coffee cup down and looked at Emma. "I was afraid of you," she said. "Not of you specifically, of what you represented. Nathan was healing and Sophie was attached, and I'd spent 3 years holding things together and I couldn't watch it fall apart again because I'd failed to see something coming." She paused. "And so I saw something that wasn't there, because seeing it protected me from having to trust that things were actually okay." Emma listened to this. She thought about it honestly. "I understand that," she said. "I don't think it was okay, but I understand the mechanism." Victoria looked at her. "My whole adult life," Emma said, "I've been the person who says the thing that costs something. I've lost jobs. I've lost situations I valued. I've spent significant amounts of time rebuilding from the fallout of telling the truth to the wrong person at the wrong time." She paused. "And I could have been bitter about it, and sometimes I was, and I could have decided that the people who hurt me were malicious, and sometimes they were. But most of the time they were just afraid of what the truth cost them, afraid of what it would change, afraid of who they'd have to be if they admitted it." She turned her coffee cup. "Fear makes people do things that look cruel from the outside, but feel like survival from the inside. I know what that looks like." Victoria was very still. "That's not absolution," Emma said. "I'm not absolving you. What you did hurt me, and the fact that fear was the reason doesn't make the hurt smaller." She held Victoria's gaze. "But I'm also not interested in staying in the hurt. I have enough experience with what happens when you do that to know it doesn't get you anywhere useful." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "You're more generous than I would be," she said, "in your position." "I'm practical," Emma said. "There's a difference." Something in Victoria's face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the specific facial movement of someone encountering a person who is more complicated than they expected, and finding this, despite themselves, interesting. "I'd like to try again," Victoria said. "Not friendship, necessarily. I don't know what we'd be, but something other than what this has been." Emma considered this. "I can work with that," she said. They finished their coffees and talked, carefully, about neutral things. Victoria's legal work, Emma's background in restaurant management, The specific organizational challenges of multi-property hospitality oversight, which Victoria had opinions about from a structural standpoint, and Emma had opinions about from a practical one, and which turned out to be a conversation that was genuinely interesting to both of them in a way that surprised them both. When they parted on the street outside, Victoria said, "Nathan told me what you asked for, the independent reporting structure." "Yes," Emma said. "It's the right call," Victoria said. "The structure he had before was, I should have flagged it years ago. The general manager having sole oversight of payroll with no independent check. It's basic." She paused. "I should have seen it." "You weren't looking for it," Emma said. "I should have been," Victoria said. "It's my job to look for it." Emma thought about this, about how often the things that go wrong are not the things anyone was actively hiding, but the things that nobody thought to look at directly. "Then look at it now," Emma said. "All 4 of the other properties. Fresh eyes on all of them." Victoria looked at her. "Together?" Emma thought about it. "Maybe," she said. "After Monday. One thing at a time." She walked home and the city was doing its March thing, the light lasting a few minutes longer each day in the almost imperceptible way of seasonal change, and she thought about how things that shift slowly are hard to see in the moment and obvious in retrospect. Monday came. She showed up at Meridian at 11. The new position had different hours, which was one of the adjustments she was still calibrating, and spent 2 hours with the Callaway family office's financial coordinator going through the payroll architecture of all 5 properties. It was detailed work, the kind she was good at, pattern recognition, discrepancy identification, the specific skill of knowing which number to look at twice. The financial coordinator was a woman named Ruth, who had been with the family office for 12 years and had the focused energy of someone who was very good at a technical job and pleased to be working with someone who asked the right questions. At 1:30, she put on her apron for the floor shift. The Meridian staff who were on that day treated her return with the specific understated normality of people who had discussed it among themselves and collectively decided that the most dignified response was to act as if the gap had not occurred. Not coldly, but practically. Paulina gave her a brief, real smile when she came through the service corridor. Diane looked up from the bar setup and said, "14's yours," which was as much ceremony as Diane ever applied to anything. The new runner, Derek, who had not been there during the worst of it, simply handed her the afternoon prep list and went back to his work. Marcus said nothing until she went through the kitchen at 2 to check on the mise en place, and then he said, without turning from his station, "Consommé's running Thursday." "I know," she said. "Thank you, Marcus." "Don't thank me," he said. "I was going to make it anyway." She understood this to mean that it was no longer a thing he did for Nathan's benefit, or for the ritual of Table 14. He made it because it was good, and because he had come, over the past months, to believe in the specific value of making things that were simply and honestly what they were. She understood also that this was his way of telling her he was glad she was back, which was enough. She worked the afternoon and through to the dinner service, and it was mostly ordinary in the way that good things are often ordinary. No dramatic reconciliation moment, no one making a speech, just the familiar rhythm of a dining room doing what dining rooms do, and her moving through it with the specific competence she'd spent 14 years building. Thursday came, 7:45. She was at table 14 when he arrived. He came through the entrance and paused at the coat check and moved through the room and sat down. He looked at the empty chair across from him, not the way he used to look at it, not that sealed, grief-hollowed look she'd first seen in November. He looked at it the way you look at something that used to be very painful and now was just part of the landscape of your life, present but no longer capable of winding you. She came to the table. "Good evening," she said. He looked up, and the thing happened. The brief fractional opening in his face, the small weather change, and he said, "Good evening, Emma." And there was something in the way he said her name that was different from the early Thursdays, but she didn't have a word for the difference yet. "Marcus has the consommé," she said. "There's also a short rib braise on the staff menu." "The consommé," he said. "Of course," she said. She went to get it. The weeks that followed were not smooth exactly. Nothing that involves actual people and actual consequences is ever smooth. But they were real. Emma settled into the dual structure of her work with the specific practicality she applied to most things, moving between the oversight function and the floor work with an ease that surprised even her. Ruth at the family office turned out to be an ally, someone who understood what Emma was looking for and why, and who had the institutional knowledge to know where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, in each property's financial history. They found two minor discrepancies at the Tribeca property, not theft, but structural errors in overtime calculation that had been quietly disadvantaging two kitchen staff for 18 months. Emma documented it, brought it to Nathan directly, and watched it get fixed within a week. She watched the two kitchen staff members receive the corrected amounts and say nothing publicly because they needed their jobs, but she knew, and that was enough. She and Victoria began meeting monthly to review the structural oversight of all 5 properties, which was an arrangement that neither of them had anticipated in March, and which both of them found, to their respective surprise, productive. Victoria brought the legal architecture. Emma brought the floor-level knowledge. The combination was better than either would have been alone, which was the kind of thing that was obvious once it was happening and had not been obvious before. They were not friends. They were something else, something that had been built out of a very specific conflict and come through it changed, which didn't have a clean name but didn't require one. Sophie came to the restaurant on a Friday evening in April. She arrived in the purple dress because it was her dinner dress and she was committed to it as a category. And she climbed onto her chair at table 14 on Fridays and immediately looked around for Emma with the focused scan of someone checking whether the right person was on shift. Emma was. She came to the table and Sophie looked up at her with the expression that was still direct and still serious and still entirely unguarded, because Sophie had not learned yet to guard herself, and Emma, for Sophie's sake, hoped the process would be slow. "Emma," Sophie said. "Sophie," Emma said. "Astronomy update." Sophie straightened. She had been waiting for this. "We can see Mars from my window right now, at around 9:30. The seeing is good this week." "The seeing," Emma repeated. "That's the atmospheric stability?" Sophie stared at her. "You've been reading." "A little." Sophie looked at her father with an expression that was somewhere between vindicated and pleased. "She's been reading," she informed him. "I see that," he said. "You should get a telescope," Sophie told Emma. "I've said this." "You've said it twice." "3 times," Sophie corrected. "Twice here, and once when I told Dad to tell you." Emma looked at Nathan. He had the expression of a man who had delivered this message and is now being held accountable for its reception. "I'm considering it," Emma said. "Saturn is coming up in June," Sophie said. "It would be a good time to start." "I'll take that under advisement," Emma said. Sophie nodded. She picked up her menu and began annotating it in the margins, which Emma had come to understand was not rudeness, but the sign of a mind that needed something to do with its hands while it processed. Nathan was watching his daughter with the expression Emma associated with his better Thursdays. Not grief-free. She didn't think he would ever be entirely grief-free, and she didn't think that was a reasonable expectation or even a desirable one, but present in it rather than flattened by it, living alongside it rather than being lived by it. "Braised chicken tonight," Emma said to him. "Marcus did it with preserved lemon. It's good." "I'll have that," he said without looking at the menu. "And for Sophie?" "The pasta," Sophie said without looking up from her annotations. "The one with the brown butter and the bread. All the bread." "I'll ask Marco to send extra," Emma said. "Thank you," Sophie said, with the specific satisfaction of someone whose needs have been accurately anticipated. Emma went to put in his order, and Marcus already had the chicken plated by the time she reached the kitchen because he'd seen Nathan come in and had started it 20 minutes ago, which was the kind of thing Marcus did without being asked and without comment, the specific language of someone who communicated primarily through the things he made. She carried the chicken out herself and set it before Nathan and stood back. He looked at it. He picked up his fork. He ate. It was not a dramatic moment. The restaurant was full. There were 7 other tables she was managing. Marcus needed a runner. Paulina had a difficult two-top in the corner who had sent back their wine twice. The world kept moving. But she noticed. She was good at noticing things, had been her whole life, and she noticed Nathan Calloway eat his dinner on a Thursday night at table 14 without the long pause before. without the looking at the empty chair, without the specific sealed heaviness of a man performing a ritual he could not stop performing. He just ate. She didn't say anything about it. She went to her other tables and managed the rest of the service, and at the end of the night she went through the kitchen to tell Marcus good night, and he said, "How was 14?" without looking up. "Good," she said. He nodded once and kept working. Summer came. The city shifted into the particular quality of a New York summer, loud and hot, and somehow more immediate than other seasons, as if the heat compressed everything into closer proximity. Meridian put tables on the sidewalk in June, which Emma had lobbied Patterson for, and which added 12 covers and made the restaurant feel different in the evenings, more connected to the street, less sealed off from the city it was part of. Nathan came on Thursdays. Sophie came on Fridays. Occasionally they overlapped on special occasions. Sophie's end-of-year school dinner, a birthday in July that Sophie organized for her father with the logistical intensity she brought to scientific inquiry, arriving at the restaurant with a hand-drawn card and a very specific request for the chocolate dessert, which she had pre-cleared with Marcus. Emma bought a telescope in June, a modest one, not the serious equipment that Sophie used, but a reasonable beginner setup that she'd researched with the same methodical attention she brought to payroll discrepancies. She set it up on her building's roof on a clear evening in late June, which required permission from her super that she obtained through a combination of patience and the specific negotiating skill of someone who has lived in New York long enough to understand that things you need require relationships. She saw Saturn on the first clear night. She stood on the roof of her building on the Upper West Side and looked through the eyepiece, and there it was. The rings, visible and real, exactly as Sophie had described them, except that description had not fully prepared her for the specific thing it did to you, seeing it. The way it made the usual size of your life feel briefly and usefully inaccurate. She texted Sophie. "I saw it." Sophie replied in 40 seconds, which meant she'd been awake past her bedtime. "The rings?" "The rings," Emma confirmed. "I told you," Sophie sent, in capitals, followed by 3 exclamation points, which was the most punctuation Emma had ever seen her use. Emma stood on the roof for another 20 minutes looking at the sky and thought about the specific strange shape of the past 8 months, about November and the consommé and the true things she'd said to a man who couldn't eat, and about the notebook with the payroll documentation and the conversation in the Midtown office, and about the Thursday in March when the floor had dropped out, and about the diner and the coffee and the long process of finding a way back to something that was not the same as what had been before, but was, in its own way, more solid. She thought about the way things that are worth having rarely arrive complete. They arrive partial and imperfect and requiring ongoing attention, and the work of keeping them is different from the work of finding them. And neither is harder than the other. They just require different things. She thought about the fact that she had spent most of her adult life being the person who said the necessary thing and paid the cost of saying it, and that this had been her nature rather than her choice, and that she had been angry about the cost for a long time, and had recently, without fully planning to, stopped being quite so angry. Not because the cost had been unfair. It had been unfair, in Brooklyn and at Meridian, and in the smaller versions of the same dynamic that had occurred throughout her working life. But because anger at the cost had always been, she was starting to understand, a way of not asking herself what she was building with the thing that the cost had purchased. What she had built, currently, was this, a job that used the specific skills she'd developed through years of noticing things other people didn't notice. A payroll system across 5 restaurants that was cleaner and more transparent than it had been a year ago. 23 people. The original 19 plus 4 others she'd found in the subsequent audit, who were being paid correctly. A relationship with a woman who had wronged her and was trying to do better, which was not the same as trust, but was something real. A beginner's telescope on a rooftop in June. And Thursdays, which were their own category. She was not going to characterize what Thursdays were exactly, because characterizing it would require more certainty than she currently had, and she had learned to be comfortable with not yet. She knew that Nathan Calloway was a complicated man who was still doing the work of becoming someone his grief hadn't finished making, and she knew that she was a complicated woman who had her own work to do, and she knew that the Thursday dinners and the floor shifts and the conversations that had been building since November were something, even if the something didn't have a name. She was not in a hurry. She was 30 years old and had spent most of her life in a hurry, hurrying to the next shift, hurrying to rebuild after the last collapse, hurrying past feelings that would slow her down. And she was discovering gradually that not hurrying was its own kind of skill. In August, Nathan asked if she wanted to go see the Perseid meteor shower. Not at a restaurant, not over a table. He asked her on a Thursday, after the service, in the quiet of the emptying dining room, with the specific, careful directness he'd been cultivating since March. The version of him that had decided the right approach to important things was to say them plainly and let the other person decide. He said, "Sophie looked up the best viewing spot in upstate New York and provided me with detailed instructions. She's staying with Victoria for the weekend. I thought..." He paused, doing the calculation she recognized as someone deciding how much of the thing to say. "I thought you might want to go." Emma looked at him. "Sophie sent me a summary of optimal viewing conditions this morning," she said. He didn't seem surprised by this. "She sent me a checklist." "She sent me the same checklist." A brief, genuine silence. "She's been planning this for a while," Emma said. "She has the certainty of someone who sees the outcome clearly," he said. "I've stopped arguing with her about it." Emma was quiet for a moment. The dining room was nearly empty. A server finishing his side work in the corner, the bar staff doing closing inventory, the kitchen sounds winding down. "I'll need to check the roof viewing conditions first," she said. He looked at her. "If my roof spot is better than upstate, the logistics are simpler," she said. "Is it?" "No," she admitted. "Sophie already told me it isn't. Light pollution is terrible." "So upstate," he said. "Upstate," she agreed. It was not a grand moment. They were two tired people at the end of a Thursday dinner service in a half-empty dining room, negotiating the logistics of a meteor shower, and it was also, she understood, something more than that, which she was going to allow herself to know without needing to name immediately. "August 12th, he said. "She's done the math." "Of course she has," Emma said. She untied her apron and picked up her bag and said goodnight to Marcus through the kitchen window, and Marcus raised one hand without turning around, which was his version of a genuine farewell. She walked out through the front entrance instead of the service door, which was a habit she'd been changing. The small choice of entering and leaving through the front of a place where she belonged, rather than the back of a place where she was provisional. The summer night was warm and actual, the city loud and close, and she stood on the sidewalk outside Meridian for a moment the way she had stood there in January before going in for the Monday meeting, except that the breath she took now was different. Not the breath before something difficult, but the breath of someone about to walk into the evening with a clear sense of where they're going and what they've earned. She walked east toward the subway. August 12th came on a Saturday. They drove up in the early afternoon. Nathan, Emma, and a cooler that Sophie had packed with sandwiches and annotated with a note that read, "Eat these in order. I've arranged them by flavor progression," and found the spot Sophie had researched, a meadow off a state park road 3 hours north of the city, where the light pollution dropped away and the sky opened up in a way that Manhattan residents forget is possible. They ate the sandwiches in the order specified, which was in fact a reasonable flavor progression, and then they lay on the blankets Sophie had also included in the cooler's companion bag and waited for the dark to fully arrive. It was not smooth. The sandwiches were slightly warm from the drive. Emma had forgotten to bring her jacket, and Nathan lent her his, which was too big. There was a period in the early evening when neither of them was sure what to talk about, and they defaulted to discussing the upstate property audit she'd done the previous month, which was technically work, and probably not the intended atmosphere, but was also genuine and unforced. And genuine and unforced was what they were best at. When the dark came fully, it came fast. And then the sky arrived. Not metaphorically, the sky arrived the way it does when you are far enough from the city to see it without interference. The depth of it, the sheer quantity of it, the specific humbling of realizing that you have been looking at a ceiling for months when you could have been looking at this. They lay on their backs in the meadow and watched. The meteors came at intervals, not constantly, not in the dramatic shower Emma had expected from the name, but sporadically, decisively, each one a quick bright line across the dark. "Sophie clocked 14 last year," Nathan said. from this exact spot. She said this year, conditions are better. She mapped conditions for a meteor shower, Emma said. She mapped conditions for a meteor shower, he confirmed. Emma looked at the sky. What are you thinking? Nathan said. He said it the way people say it when they actually want to know, not as a conversational device. She thought about what she was actually thinking, which was multiple things in the particular layered way of a person who has been quiet for a while and has had time to notice what's happening in their own head. That I spent a long time being angry, she said, about the cost of things. Brooklyn and the year after, and then Meridian and the March thing. And I'm not very angry anymore, and I'm not sure exactly when that changed. He was quiet. I think it changed when the situation actually changed, she said. When the people who deserved to be paid correctly got paid correctly. When the structure got fixed rather than papered over. The anger was... It was information. It was telling me that something was wrong and I should say so. And I said so, and something happened about it, and the anger stopped having a job to do. What does it feel like now? He said. Without it? She thought about this honestly. Lighter, she said, but also less familiar. I'm still figuring out what to do with lighter. He was quiet for a moment. A meteor crossed the upper left quadrant of the sky. Bright, sustained, the kind that made you involuntarily say, oh. I'm still figuring out what to do with present, he said. 3 years of being somewhere else in my own life, and now I'm here. I'm not always sure what to do with that. I know, she said. Sophie is better at it than I am, he said. Being present. She doesn't remember enough of the before to grieve it the way I do. She just lives in it. The current version. She's good at that, Emma said. She's good at looking at the thing in front of her. She gets that from her mother, he said. He said it the way he'd said things about Claire over the months, not without pain, but with the specific quality of someone who has learned to carry a thing without putting it down, who has found that it is possible to hold grief and also to hold other things at the same time, that the hands are larger than they seem. Tell me about her, Emma said. Claire. He was quiet for a moment. She had not asked before. She had understood over the months that it was a door he would open when he was ready, and that her job was not to push it, but to be present when it opened. She was asking now because she thought he was ready, and because she was ready to know. He told her. He talked for a long time, while the meteors came and went above them, about a woman who had been his opposite in the specific way that works, practical, where he was theoretical, warm in rooms where he was reserved, certain about people in a way he had to work at. A woman who had made him eat when they were first together by the same mechanism Emma had discovered at Meridian, by simply telling him the true thing about what the food wasn't and waiting until he was ready to hear it. A woman who had wanted Sophie fiercely from the beginning and had been the kind of mother who made the project of it look effortless, which Nathan now knew it wasn't, and which he had not always understood when she was alive, and which he carried as one of the many things he wished he'd said while there was time. Emma listened. She didn't try to fix any of it or reframe it or make it smaller. She just listened, the same way she listened when Nathan's Thursday conversation moved towards something real, with the full attention of someone who understood that being heard was not a small thing, that it was sometimes the thing that made the difference between a person staying sealed inside their loss and a person finding the door. When he finished, the sky was quiet for a moment. No meteors, just the static of stars. She sounds like someone worth grieving, Emma said. She is, he said. She also sounds like someone who would have wanted you to eat your dinner, Emma said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised him, the kind she'd been hearing more of lately, the kind that didn't happen in a person who is still mostly sealed. She would have had strong opinions about my restaurant management also, he said. I think she would have liked the independent reporting structure, Emma said. She would have designed it better than I did, he said. They lay in the meadow and the meteors came back. 4 in quick succession, scattered across the sky like someone making a point. Emma counted them. Nathan counted them. 12 so far, he said. 14, she said. You missed 2 on the left side. He turned his head to look at her. You're going to keep track better than I do, he said. Someone has to, she said. He looked at her in the dark, in the specific way that had been building since November, and had been named by nothing and required nothing to be named. Not yet, not tonight. Tonight was for meteors and sandwiches and the things that didn't need language. Emma, he said. Yeah, she said. Thank you, he said, for all of it, from the beginning. She looked at the sky. The food wasn't the problem, she said. You know that now. I know that now, he said. Above them, the 15th meteor crossed the dark, the longest one yet, bright and deliberate, the kind that Sophie would have annotated and measured and filed as evidence for her ongoing argument that the universe was larger and stranger and more worth paying attention to than most people bothered to notice. Emma watched it go. She thought about a corner table in a restaurant and a man who ordered food he couldn't eat, and a 7-word sentence that had started something neither of them had known they were starting. She thought about the fact that the most important things she'd ever done had not looked from the outside like important things. A bowl of soup, a notebook, a text message, a conversation in a diner where she drank cold coffee and told a man he could come back. She thought about the cost of saying the true thing and the specific thing that the cost had purchased, and she looked at the sky and thought, yes, worth it. The night moved around them, patient and enormous, and they lay in the meadow and counted meteors, and got to 19 before Nathan fell asleep beside her, which was so human and so imperfect that she smiled without meaning to, and pulled his jacket a little tighter around herself, and kept watching the sky. She had nowhere to be in the morning. For the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.